If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
For those who take walks or go out at night in isolated places, like rural areas, woods, forests, etc., what's the scariest thing you've seen?
The reason I don't visit my local forest anymore. My story was when the summer of 2019 was at its peak. At that time, me and my friends, let's call them Mike, Anthony, and Andrew, were around 12-13 years old, with me being the oldest by some months. On a summer evening at around 9:30 p.m., we wanted to head to my grandma's apartment to watch a movie together that would start at 10:15 p.m. Unfortunately, I still had to walk with my 13-year-old dog through our local forest that was 10 meters away from the entrance of our apartment house. Additionally to that, the sun was already set, and it was about to become dark in a matter of minutes. That was a problem for me since I have, till this day, a phobia for the dark. Although today it's much more moderate than it was back then, anyway. I convinced my friends to follow me in completing this routine. They all agreed, although Andrew and Anthony had to change clothes, which led us to enter the forest in complete darkness. At that night it was even a bit foggy, but we thought we were fine since we had pretty strong flashlights with us. About 3 minutes in the forest, we already noticed something strange. We heard an unfamiliar sound, a sound that sounded like a dying man and a bear screaming in pain, both mixed together with a scream coming from the deepest depths of hell. We were scared, but we thought that it might be just someone pulling a prank on us since something similar happened to another group just a few hundred meters away from this forest. So we continued our journey, and while we were walking, we heard footsteps in the forested area around the path we took. Andrew began to joke around that there might be a bear that'll eat us, but we just told him to shut up as we were scared already. Just 5 minutes later, we heard a tree cracking and pointed the lights at where the sound came from. What we saw would haunt us for years and makes me uncomfortable to go to my local forest, even at daylight. We saw a completely dark creature that was pitch black, even when the lights were on it. It had almost no color at all. The only thing that was colored was its bloody white, wide open eyes that stared at us while it held half of a tree. It just broke apart. I cannot remember any other physical attributes, but the things I remember were that it was huge and thin, very thin, almost like it starved to death and stayed in that position for weeks or months. After just a few seconds of spotting this thing, it threw the half tree at us, and as it did, my friends began to run. We were running for our lives. We spread out. Me and Mike were running the path that led to home while Anthony and Andrew were running through the forest. While I was running, I had to pick up my dog since he wasn't able to run that fast anymore. We later arrived back at home, and no one was harmed, fortunately, but it could have ended in a drama. After that point, I was too scared of the dark to be left alone, and I never went to the forest at night ever again. This happened to me a few hours ago on my walk home from my coworker's house. It was 9 p.m. when I left her house and began my walk back to my own. I walked up the street and decided I'd take the trail that leads to a park close to my house since it would be a lot faster than walking through the neighborhoods. How the trail was set up, there were houses on the left side of it across a street, and to the right, about 4 feet from where I was standing, was brush that led down to a very large, overgrown area. I had my AirPods in and was on the phone with my mom when all of a sudden I heard what sounded like a growl from something big. I stopped in my tracks and took out one of my AirPods only to hear heavy footsteps from something about a foot into the brush. I guess when it comes to stuff like this, I'm not a fighter. I instantly took off from the trail and ran into the neighborhood. I looked back for only a second to see the brush moving right where I was standing moments ago. My head started to hurt, and my broken arm was banging into my chest with every step, but I ignored the pain. I took a right and then another, and I was across the street from the park. From where I was, I could see over the trail since it dipped down into a tunnel that led to the park. I started walking to catch my breath, only to hear a loud roar on the trail from something big and angry. I immediately started running again and told my mom in a broken sentence that something roared on the trail. At this point all I had to do was walk down the street and take a right to make it back to my house, so I knew unless this thing had super speed I was safe. I made it home, and the adrenaline wore off, but after having hours to think, I wonder what that thing was and would have happened to me if I stuck around on that trail. I think I watched myself walk home. Before I get into my story, please note that I do not, have not, and will not get into drugs or narcotics. And that what I am saying is the absolute truth, as fake as it may sound. Please listen. As a 16-year-old female, I enrolled in a course that required my physical presence. The course took place at a school that was a 40 to 45 minute walk depending on your pace. For the most part, though, my dreadful coordination has led me to getting lifts from my mother each morning to the school. From school, however, I'd have to walk home, as she finishes at a later hour. I still remember feeling nervous about walking home alone. I'd never done it before, as I'm a dependent person relying heavily on other people to help guide me through life. It's something I'm working on, and I knew this would be a step in the right direction even if it wasn't by choice. The first few times were smooth sailing. It's a fairly simple path despite being a long walk. By my standards, at least. I don't get out much. But I felt comfortable with the process nonetheless. Until this one particular day after the class ended. I of course started the walk home once the classes concluded, alone, and started feeling odd. I'm not sure how one would describe the feeling of being watched other than creeped out? Like, not just a simple glance over, it felt like someone was actively observing every step I take, but that's when my focus drifted back to the person walking ahead of me. They weren't directly in front of me. I'm not good with estimates, so if I had to guess, I'd say 14 meters away. Enough for me to make out their features. I didn't notice this before, as I tend to shy away from looking at people, but I realized that this person has all too familiar features. Their hair, clothing, bag, hell, even their odd gait matched my own. And their pinky finger. In the previous year, I punched a brick wall, which left my pinky finger deformed. That girl had the exact same thing on the exact same hand. It's not a coincidence. I didn't know what to do other than to act like nothing was wrong, but at the same time I couldn't look away from her. I was freaking out on the inside. I watched her, trying to see if perhaps I could catch a glimpse of her face and get the confirmation I wanted. That this really is just a coincidence, and I'm overthinking this whole thing. I couldn't tell if she started catching on that someone was watching her, but she would not stop walking down the same roads. Going in the direction of my home. Looking exactly like me. She just walked around the freaking corner and poof. Gone. I felt even more freaked out. I don't know what to think. Am I going crazy? Did I imagine the whole experience? I don't want to walk home again. I need help. I am not sure who is hiding there. 3 weeks ago, I and a friend went for a walk late at night, 3 a.m. or so, and just walked around my city for a while. In my city, we have a park that is connected to a forest, and while I was little, I heard tons of stories about satanic cults in there, but I just thought they were stories to scare little children. At about 4 a.m., we entered the park and went in about 15 feet when we saw a little light that was flickering. My friend, with better vision than me, kept telling me it was a bonfire, in the middle of the park. I didn't believe him and went like 5 more steps and realized that after a line of pure shadow, it was pitch dark. When I looked better, I saw about 10 people in white suits and hats walking around a bonfire. We both bolted out of there. I haven't been there since and don't know exactly who or what I saw. Also, I heard stories of satanic cults in the forest that the park is in, satanic signs on trees, kidnapped people, tents in the middle of the forest. Does anyone know of similar encounters? Man sitting alone in woods. Years ago, I was walking my dog with my sister at a farm right by my house. The farm owner, a nice lady who still runs it today, lets the public use the farm and the woods for free to walk their dogs as long as dogs stay on their leads when by the farm animal pens and fields. The farm is quite big, and if you walk further in, there's a little wood at the back of it, which is normally quite deserted. We always feel safe walking here, though, because we've both known the farm owner since we were babies, and the walls surrounding the farm are massive and couldn't be easily climbed over, if that makes sense. Anyway, we go into the farm and make our way to the woods because we can let the dog off his lead here. He can't come off lead in the farm for obvious reasons, but the woods are gated off to all the sheep and horses, etc. We let him off the lead and start walking around. The woods go in a big circle around the farm, so we usually just do a little lap of the woods before coming back into the farm and then going home. We're walking along chatting, and then sitting ahead of us on a fallen tree log was a man. He was just sitting there. What I mean is he wasn't drinking a coffee he'd bought from the little farm shop at the farm. He didn't have a dog with him. He was just sitting on the log, staring straight ahead at the trees and the woods. We carry on walking, and as we come close to him, he suddenly looks over at us quite quickly and says, "The only way out of this place is over there," in this monotone voice, and points at the woods, a part of the woods that just leads to more woods and then a brick wall that surrounds the farm. We just ignored him and carried on walking. We told the lady who owns the farm that there was a man in the woods, and she said she hadn't seen anyone go in there before us but asked us nevertheless what he was doing. We said he wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, but we did tell her what he had said to us. She looked confused and went into the woods with us and asked us to show her where he had been, so we did. We showed her where he had pointed, and she said, "That leads to the wall that used to separate the farm from the railway tracks." Apparently years before there was a railway next to the farm that stopped being used for whatever reason some 30 years before and now just sits there overgrown and desolate. I don't know what the man meant by that being the only way out of the woods, but the whole thing made me feel unnerved. We never saw him again, and neither did the farm owner. A walk in the haunted Hoyabachu forest. Many times, my best friend and I would walk through the Hoyabachu forest as a shortcut when it got dark, primarily to save time and avoid our parents' ire. I don't know about him, but I was pretty scared some of the times, especially as the forest is said to be haunted, and we had a strange experience where the batteries of our phones went from being somewhat well charged, mine around 80% and his a little above 60%, to 0% and closing. Only once, among the countless times we strolled through that place at night, did we feel frightened, until we decided to play around and joke about it. I told him to go near some bushes to take some scary photos. The next thing I see is the flashlight from my phone stopping and my screen showing the message not enough battery to run the flashlight. Then it shut down. I told him about it. I kept saying that I left with my phone having a full battery and there was no way it could discharge so fast, but he kept denying it until I believed so too. I insisted on going back, but he kept on trying to explain it scientifically, like that there is a magnetic field that could have done that. We watched his battery carefully, and suddenly he yells at me that it is going down. We watched the percentage go down from above 60% to 0%, and when his phone shut down as well, we were left in complete darkness, pretty freaked out already. We started running back on the track we came, and when I tried to restart my phone to see the time, I noticed the battery was back to normal. I told him to start his phone too, and it happened again. Both our phones recharged by themselves once we got out of the forest, just like nothing happened. Anyway, I believed that if we hadn't joked about it, nothing would have happened. I took that as a lesson, and since then, I respect that place much more, and I'm not joking around with this sort of stuff anymore. That's it, basically. A memory I'll surely never forget. Graveyard stories. I'm a graveyard nerd. It's quiet there, with beautiful landscaping. A great place to take reflective walks. One day it was very hot, and I wanted to sit down. The closest thing besides the ground was a crypt that sat alone in the fork of one of the paths. I very respectfully said, "Please, may I sit here and rest a while?" As I climbed on top. Almost immediately, I felt 2 knocks underneath me. I told myself it's my imagination. 2 more knocks. I say out loud, I mean you, no disrespect. Knock twice more if you just want me to leave. It hesitated, then 2 distinct hard knocks hit me right in the bum where I sat. I said, okay, I'm going. Another time I went near dark. I've walked through the children's section many times. I've seen the toys people have placed on the children's graves. Some of them look 50+ years old. This night I didn't just walk past them. I stopped and thanked them all for coming here and trying to fulfill their destiny in some way, and told them I'm sorry it was cut short. As soon as I said rest in peace, one of those old decrepit toys began to flash little lights and play music. My so noped all the way to the car. I actually stayed and tried to talk, but nothing else happened. Last one. I went to a different graveyard this time. In an old Moravian graveyard with graves as far back as the 1500s, maybe earlier, but I couldn't read them all. This graveyard has huge hills with mausoleums tucked into the hills. I like to sit on top of one and look out over the whole place. Very serene. This day I sat up there and watched a fox spinning circles way down at the bottom of the hill. He acted confused, like he had rabies. I wasn't going to move until he left, so I waited. A woman came from I didn't even know where because I could see the whole place. She walked towards a grave near where this fox was spinning around. I got worried for her and stood up to scream down to her that there was a rabid fox and to run away. But when I stood up, she wasn't there anymore. I waited for the fox to show itself again, but it was gone too. Just like that. Gone. I very cautiously climbed down and went down the hill to where I saw all this happen. No woman. No fox. Nothing but quiet graves and beautiful flowers. A weird dog keeps following me home. I leave work at midnight and walk home, as I live about 15 minutes away. No bus at that time, and I don't drive. Most of my route home is down streets and is well lit. However, there's a trail about 5 minutes long I need to turn down to get home. It's not pitch black. There are maybe 2 street lights down the whole path, so it's still pretty dark. One side is a dirt path, the others are woodland, bushes, and trees that lead out into a forest and fields. About a month ago, as I was walking, I saw what looked like a huge dog. I mean huge. If it stood on its back legs, I would estimate it would be over 6 feet. It wasn't though it was on all fours and it's pitch black. It popped out from behind a bush and just stared at me. I picked up the pace and got home. It gave me the creeps. The following night, I see it again, only this time it steps out from behind the bush. It didn't cross over to my side, It just stared again. This time though, as I briskly walked, it followed me, keeping up on its side of the track. How can a dog know what time I'm going to be there and why it's following me? This is happening 9 nights out of 10. I told a friend, and he walked with me only that night. You guessed it, it didn't show. I decided I was going to take the longer route home, I thought. Only when I got home was it hanging around near my house. I was so scared. It approached me on this occasion, and I was filled with terror and more scared than I've ever been. It didn't act like a dog at all, it had hatred in its eyes, plus its eyes looked human. It never barked or anything. It just stares me down all stoic, like I noticed it has a deformed set of back paws, they are twisted backwards. Weird, right? This thing is hanging around my house, and lately I've been having night terrors and nightmares. When I'm not alone, it doesn't show up. I don't know what to do really. I live in Yorkshire, UK. The wolf across the field. My first encounter was last year. I have a German Shepherd, Hades, and a husky pup, Ragnar. That day I left university quite late. It was already dark outside. Usually, I don't mind taking them out at night. At night I can let them run without their leashes. They are trained, and I know they are going to listen to me. Besides, I knew everyone knew them and wouldn't hurt them even if they were left outside. They have collars that light up since Hades is fully black and Ragnar is fully white, which makes it hard to see him during the winter. I could see them all the time. We walked for a while, and they were playing and running around. At some point, Hades stopped and started growling, looking into the wheat fields down the hill. I didn't think about it. There are bats, owls, and other creatures around us. I left them, not wanting to run after them if they decided to chase something. After half an hour of non-stop growling, I had enough of it and decided to take Hades home and go out so Ragnar can run a bit more. I got home and expected him to go in his cage. He likes sleeping there, and I never locked them. That night, though, all he did was stand on the window, looking out. Since the pup was whining and wanting to go out again, I tried to drag Hades in the cage and lock him in until I got back. Who knew? Maybe he might try going out the window. I gotta look out the window. On the parking lot below, I saw a black figure circling the cars. Thinking that it might be someone trying to steal, I got a flashlight and shone at it. It wasn't a theft. It wasn't human at all. It looked up, its eyes reflecting the light from the flashlight. It was black, its head looking very similar to Hades. It was standing on all fours, but when I shone the light, it stood up. The roofs of the cars were barely reaching their midsection. It let out a growl, which I later learned that many of the tenants have heard. Hades went wild, trying to bust out of the cage. Ragnar was whining even louder. I realized he didn't want to go out, he was trying to get as far away from the window as possible. The growl made me flinch, and I dropped the flashlight through the window. I tried to see it again, but it was too dark. I heard the crunching of snow as it left. The next morning I went to find my flashlight and found huge dog-like footprints in the snow and a foul smell still lingering. I borrowed infrared binoculars from a hunter friend of mine. Ever since then, I have seen it 4 times in the forest, twice crossing the field, and once coming near the hill looking up. I and my roommate have been taking turns keeping watch at night when Hades starts growling. I don't take the dogs out at night, and Ragnar doesn't play and run around anymore. He just stays pressed against my feet. I hope he grows out of it. My walk in the dark. Despite my size and lack of strength at the time, I believed I was a good runner. At this point, I would typically leave for my friends at 6:45 and return around 8 to 9 to engage in my own activities. However, the fall and winter months were significantly darker than the summer months. It was fall, so the roads were still clear to use my electric scooter to get home. It's faster than maybe a 5 to 10 minute walk with headphones. It was around maybe 8:45. Somewhere between 8 and 9 when I started to roll my way home. I was maybe halfway there when I was on a path that goes behind houses and just to the side of a school and some trees. A lot of the walking paths were completely pitch black, and the only thing that kept me from falling flat on my face was the knowledge of where the ditches were because I go on walks often. Just at the end of the path, before you find the light of the street again in the front of the school, there is the darkest part, with a massive ditch to the left with it being hollow except for some trees and bushes covering it on the rim and a smaller ditch to the right. AKA is a perfect, invisible, and simple spot to hide from anyone without a powerful light. I had just made it onto the street when I started hearing an echo of footsteps that made it sound like 2 pairs of feet. I rationalized it to be me slapping my foot too hard on the concrete whenever I pushed. But I didn't push too often, and the footsteps didn't match sometimes. So I slowed down and waited a step, barely moving to listen, a stupid move, and I didn't hear a sound. A rush of relief hits me, and I continue, But they start up again. During this time I didn't dare look back, and I sped up, and a few seconds later they did too. You might be thinking, how could they keep up if it was an electric scooter? But it was not very strong, and all it really did was give me less work to do, but it was easy to catch up with if I wasn't using my life force to make it go faster. I was going decently fast, making sure not to look back or give any indication that I knew, and going at a fairly normal but fast speed. I was so close to home and thinking for maybe a minute, this is ridiculous, you're just overreacting about an echo and you're acting like a 9-year-old, and that's when I turned onto my street feeling a bit better, and the most ear-crushing tweet or whistle sound came from behind me to my right, and I looked for a second to see something. But I didn't care to die looking, so I booked it, not making a sound, rushing and almost destroying my shoes to make it home, and I heard nothing except my own feet hitting the ground. Luckily, the garage was open, and I rushed inside and closed the garage, the lights still on, looking out to see anyone. I never saw the person and was scared to death for the rest of the evening and week. Whenever I went over there, I never took that route again, and once after someone accompanied me home. Some people say it was my imagination, but even if so, where the hell did the whistle behind me come from? Late night walk. I don't think I have schizophrenia, but I do sometimes hear shit that I'm not sure is always real. I'm not sure if this time it was in my head, but one night I was with my girlfriend, and we were sitting at a park under the playground. We kept hearing this weird creaking sound, and we didn't think much of it, but once I actually asked her, "Do you hear that?" The noise stopped. A few seconds later, it started again, a bit louder. This creeped us out, so we ran into the light of the one street light at the park. Turned around, and we saw someone move behind a tree in the direction the sound was coming from. That scared the duck out of us, so we decided to leave. We went for a walk to school and back, then went back to the park because it was getting late and we had to say goodbye and go home. I gave her my knife because she was scared, so now I was basically defenseless. She walks off into the darkness. I start walking home, and as I get out of the park, I start hearing some loud sounds. I don't think they were humans, it sounded sort of like a monkey or something. But it was definitely not a monkey. It wasn't coming from any certain direction, I could just hear it. Didn't get any louder or softer no matter which way I walked. So obviously that freaked me out. I started sprinting, crossed the road, and it stopped. Now I was on my street, but I got a weird feeling I was being watched. I heard some rustling in a bush next to me, sprinted to my house, and went inside. Nothing else happened that night. When I was 14 or 15, I was walking through my neighborhood alleys with a friend. Some alleys had chain links so you could see through into people's yards. Bear in mind we're not rural or anything, this was an extremely developed peninsula in Florida. There's almost no nature except the beach, and we were still a couple miles away from that. Anyways, in the alley we were walking and chatting and it just sparked a joint. We had each only taken one hit. I say this because I don't think weed is to blame, but I know some might assume, when we noticed two what looked like huge wolves running through someone's yard in the opposite way we were walking. Our jaws dropped, and we both stared as the wolves ran next to each other side by side, and as they reached the extra tall privacy wooden fence on the other side of the yard, they both, in unison, gracefully scaled the tall fence in one jump and disappeared over the other side. We both ran back to the other yard and tried to look through the wood but saw nothing. They were either going too fast or could not be detected by our human eyes anymore. They ran perfectly in sync. The coloring on the fur was black, white, and gray. Their eyes were glowing yellow. They didn't look at us at all. I can't remember whether they materialized into the yard mid-run or if they jumped over the fence on the other side of the yard. They were enormous, surpassing the size of any large dog by threefold. After a few seconds of stunned silence, we turned to each other and said, "Did you just see that?" We had both seen the same thing. This was about 15 years ago, and we're still friends. Every couple of years I'll call her on the phone and say, "Do you remember the wolves?" And she'll say, yes. We've never forgotten. For me it is a vivid memory, the way their paws moved in unison, that graceful jump straight up and over the fence. I mean, that fence was like 8 feet tall at least, and they just cleared it like nothing. And the eyes, I'll never forget the way they glowed. I haven't looked too much into these things, but I've never come across stories of wolf-like entities. Anyone have any insight on what they could have been? My true doppelganger story. Context: at the time I was 17 and living in Denver. It was during the summer and took place in my parents' cabin in rural Colorado outside of Estes Park in a wooded area with the nearest people being 7 miles north. It was summer, and as a teenager who has nothing to do, my mom encouraged me to drive out to our underused cabin in rural Colorado. Before I left, my girlfriend texted that she wanted to come over to my house, so I invited her to the summer home. She planned to leave before night. The drive to Denver from the house is not short, but that night she would not be doing so. We brought 2 cars, her, a minivan, and me, a Ram. We spent some time walking outside or watching TV and such. By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, I decided to stay the night, and my girlfriend was going to leave in a few minutes, so I told her, "You can leave whenever, but right now I'm going to grab pillows from my truck." The cars had to be parked a quarter mile up from the house, so I began my walk, got to the car, grabbed my pillows, walked back, and saw my girlfriend absolutely distraught. She was walking for the door a minute after I left to catch up to me when at the door she told me, "I heard a light scratch," then apparently she heard in my voice, "Hey, open the door and let me in." Luckily, my girlfriend is very paranoid and decided to look through a window to see me walking down the road oblivious and nobody at the door. I am confident that neither of us were under the influence, and we were both sober. But that is only the first of 2 encounters. Both of us were freaked out by this, so we closed windows and doors and slept through the night completely fine. She left quickly at around 8 a.m., and I was left alone. I decided to stay because I was actually enjoying the freedom of being alone until it came to an end when I returned to the cabin. After entering, I crossed the large room to sit on the couch. When I shit you not, I hear my girlfriend at the door sounding distraught, saying, "Open the door, oh, please, please open the damn door," accompanied by a scraping sound on the concrete path. I called out and said, "What the hell is going on?" I hear a reply in my own voice. "Open the door, don't be a fool." I locked myself in the bathroom and called my dad to come over. I stayed in the bathroom until he got to the cabin, and I told him everything. I don't know if he believed me, but the next day we left immediately. Screams in the forest. This happened 7 years ago, when me and my brother were 12. It was Christmas break, so we were visiting our grandma in Poland. The village she lives in is surrounded by a big forest, and we love to take walks there. One day, our mom told us to take the dog out for a walk before it gets dark. Mind you, it was around 4 p.m. in wintertime, so the sun has already almost set. We put our thick coats and shoes on, and off we go. When we first entered the forest, I felt uneasy, as if something was watching us. I brushed the feeling off until I heard a woman scream. I turned to look at my brother to see if he had heard it too, and by his expression I could tell he did. We figured it was an animal or something, so we kept walking. We heard the screams 2 more times, they were getting closer and closer, then we ran back home. We never told anyone about what happened. My brother jokingly said it might be a skinwalker, but I know they don't appear in these parts. As I already mentioned, it could have been an animal, but the screams felt so human. It freaked my dog out pretty bad, too. We still don't know what it was. Creepy cult. When I was younger, I used to sneak out from my parents all the time during the night since I was grounded a lot. I remember I met up with a boy, nothing romantic, and we walked to a park that's quite far down a long road opposite my house, until we got to a well-known woods area that had a park right at the front of it. But if you worked a little bit further, there was another little park next to some stables. Of course, being about 2 a.m. and there being no street lights in this wood/park, it was extremely dark. I was about 17 though, so I acted brave and went through with it anyway. The boy and I walked through and went and sat on the swings on this little park that overlooked the field that entered the woods, just gossiping and doing whatever a youngster does these days. Anyway, I can't remember how long it was in until this happened, but about 8 people with cloaks, yes, cloaks, started walking through the field with lanterns. Not flashlights, lanterns. I couldn't quite see what they looked like, but they sounded just like a group of older kids with the way they talked. But with cloaks and lanterns? It made me go cold. At this point I was scared. But at least they couldn't see us, as we had no light, and we just sat there on these swings in silence, watching in awe. We watched as they walked along the field and entered the woods on the other side. It was such a relief to watch them leave. What if they'd seen us? Me and the boy sat gossiping about what we just saw. It was the strangest encounter ever. Until about 10 minutes later, we heard absolutely terrifying screams coming from the woods that sounded like a much older woman than any of the people we saw. It wasn't as if the scream was a playful scream, or even, like I said, a scream of one of the people we saw walking, as this sounded like an elderly woman. The screaming went on for about 10 minutes, and I considered calling the police, but the boy I was with didn't want us to get involved. I thought that I'm calling them. However, within that instant, the screaming stopped, there was nothing. Complete silence. You bet your arse we were out of there. There were no sightings or anything heard of what happened that night, and their screams haunted me for a good couple of years after. Nobody had been killed or discovered. The woods aren't very big, so it's not as if a body was just left there without being discovered. It was almost like a dream, although it wasn't. And it was never brought up again. Me and the boy didn't end up speaking on it. I can't even remember who it was. Weird. During winter in a rural, no cell service kind of area. Completely dark, no street lights nor anyone in sight. Temperatures were around 20 and it was snowing. I was walking my dog with a flashlight. Then I heard someone start screaming bloody murder. Flight or fight kicked in. It truly sounded like someone was being stabbed to death for what seemed like forever. I chose to find out what the hell was going on. What I found instead was beyond anything I expected. He was a 5-year-old boy wandering down the road all alone. All he was wearing were light flannel pants and a thin t-shirt. No shoes or hat. And screaming so loudly it echoed through the hills. I dropped my dog's leash and walked up to him slowly, gently, and repeatedly, telling him that I'm a mom and that he's going to be okay. I wrapped him in my arms and carried him to a neighbor's home to warm him by the fire and call for help. I've never been afraid of the dark. I grew up in the countryside, where the nearest streetlight was 10 miles away, so I'm comfortable in dark places, so much so that I often take my dog for a walk at around midnight just because I like the peace and quiet of the night. I live in a city now, so something about the dark is just soothing to me. That being said, one of the scariest things I've ever experienced, I genuinely have no explanation for. Living in a city, I used to drive out 20 to 30 miles into the country to do some astrophotography. As I'm driving out one night, I see this guy walking at the side of the road with no lights, reflectors, and a big backpack. I didn't think much of it other than it being a little odd. 5 miles later, I see the same guy walking again. I haven't changed directions or turned, and I've been doing 50 miles per hour. As I drove past, he looked and waved at me. I was pretty spooked, but I drove on. I must be imagining things. It can't be the same guy. I get to my field in the middle of nowhere, park up and get the camera out, and turn off all the lights so my eyes adjust to the dark. All is going well, and for 30 minutes I'm content and starting to relax. Suddenly I hear a rustling near the hedge by the road. Crunching leaves, grass being kicked. It was footsteps. I immediately get a feeling of dread, like I'm in severe danger and something bad is going to happen. I grab my camera, toss it in the car, get in, lock the doors, and turn on the headlights. When I turn out of the field, I passed where I heard the noise and saw fresh footprints in the mud but no sign of anyone. I race back home, driving double the speed limit, constantly checking my mirrors for anyone. I park up around the corner and wait in the car with the lights off for 30 minutes, watching. Nothing shows up. I get home, lock all the doors, and sleep with a knife under my pillow that night. I honestly don't know what really happened that night, but part of me knows the creepy guy I passed on the road twice was in that field. All of this occurred approximately 2 weeks ago. I am a 21-year-old female, approximately 5 feet 4 inches in height. So I live in a block of flats in the United Kingdom in Northumberland. The flats are 2 floors with 7 flats on each row. There are 3 blocks off these, with the first floor having a balcony going along, which is quite old, so it creaks when you walk on it. Lucky me got the flat in the end, so I'm closest to the stairs. Round, where I live, is a wooded area with a skate park, a massive field, and 2 football nets. I was out late at night with my 6-year-old Jackawawa, Bella, and 3-year-old Chihuahua, Buddy. Bella is usually loud, she barks at anyone and anything, while Buddy is quiet. As we were walking along the small path in the woods, Buddy started acting strange. He would keep stopping, cowarding. Hess such a great guard dog. A few more minutes down the path, and Bella started growling and snarling into the trees. I looked but saw nothing, so I shrugged it off as a fox or a rabbit. We continued our walk, and Bella then refused to walk. She put her legs into lockdown, crouched down, and was growling viciously into the trees. Now I was starting to feel uneasy, as usually she just barks if she hears someone or another animal, never growl. I picked her up and walked faster out of the wooded area, and near the skate park, Bella was basically on my shoulder watching behind me, barking and growling, but still I couldn't see or hear anyone. I tried to calm her down, but she was having none of it. It wasn't until I turned the corner to get off the path that I saw a barefooted man standing staring at us. I started backing off slowly. He didn't move. I don't know if Bella intimidated him because she generally sounded like she wanted blood. I quickly turned around and ran. I looked back a few seconds up the field, and no one was there. Then I heard the dreaded sound of someone running after me. I kept looking back, but he would always keep at least a 10-foot distance between us. I found this rather strange. Buddy, who was running by my side, then snapped and was running on his lead, trying to pull off to get to the man. I then had to pick him up, so I was then running with 2 dogs and trying to get away from some weird creeper. I quickly turned and ran up the alleyway, way around from mine, and up the path. I turned around at the end to see if he was there, and he was nowhere in sight. I took the opportunity to run to mine and up the stairs to the first floor. I ran in the house and locked the door. I put the dogs down in the bedroom so they would hopefully calm down. By now they had stopped growling and were sitting right by my side as if guarding me. I lay back on the bed and broke down into tears. About an hour later, my boyfriend comes home, and I explain to him what happened and end up breaking down again. He pulls me close and hugs me for what seems forever. I never saw that man again, but I never walked that way alone again. What did he want? Why me? Was he just trying to scare me, or was there something more sinister he had in mind? Either way, let's not meet again. In 2017, me and my buddy liked going out into the desert out east of Phoenix into the mountains to find abandoned mines and just explore. Most of the time we went out late at night, so this wasn't anything new. This time it was about 2 a.m. when we decided we were bored and were going to drive over the mountains by the Beeline Highway to Theodore Roosevelt Lake. It took well over an hour to get to the peak, where we found an old abandoned radio tower. Regardless, we arrive at this tower and exit to begin our exploration. I'll try to describe this as best as I can. We parked the Jeep at the front of the tower area. It was fenced off with barbed wire at the top of the fence. I'd guess about 40 feet across. The left side had about 20 feet of room to walk before there was a mini cliff. The right side was wide, open cactus and sagebrush. I went right, and my buddy went left. Wandering around, looking at the tower with the flashlight. I pointed the light behind the tower and saw two pure white figures. No clothes. No features. Lanky looking. They started slowly walking towards me. I put my hand on my gun on my hip and yelled hey, and they kept walking towards me. Finally, I drew my handgun and pointed it at them and yelled again. Without any noise at all, they started running towards the side of the fence my buddy was on. It was eerie. I yelled to my friend to get to the Jeep. He saw them before he started running. We got in the Jeep and booked it down the other side of the mountain. We didn't see a single vehicle the entire trip up or down. We were super shaken up, and even typing this up now my eyes are watering and I get shaky. I have no idea what it was or could have been, but it was the most unsettling thing I've ever experienced. We went back up there with a group of 8 a couple weeks later and ran into a black Mexican Jaguar in the same spot that was stalking us. We fired into the ground, and it ran, but came back a few minutes later. I don't know if it was related but also unsettling. Not a walk, but I frequently run in the wee hours of the morning. Where I live is basically suburbia meets country roads. Anyway, one morning about 4 o'clock I went for a long run. About 2 miles and along a sidewalk out in the middle of nowhere next to a cow field, I saw two individuals, a male and female, fully dressed in what I would describe as fancy/couture clothing, standing on the sidewalk, giving me the 50-year-old stare. The man had no eyebrows and was wearing sunglasses while the woman stared at me with a look I can only describe as Gaga in American Horror Story. It was completely dark, minus a small light above the cow field about 20 yards away. They didn't say a word, they didn't move when I was running towards them. Only staring at me without moving a single facial muscle. I immediately noped and ran to the other side of the street and ran as hard as I could. As I ran past them, they both turned their torsos with the exact same facial expressions in synchrony. Both of them had this weird smile on their faces, almost like they knew who I was. It almost felt like they were analyzing me, or as if their eyes were seeing through me. They never said a word and never made any other movements. When I circled back an hour later, they were gone. I've never been more creeped out on a run, and I've run past snakes, crack addicts, floods, and a man without pants. Meeting weird people where there should be no one. I exercise a lot and lift weights, but I am still fat because I eat too much. Since I live in the desert, I usually walk in the evening or late at night to avoid the 100+ degree weather. Almost a year ago I went for an evening walk and decided to sprint for 30 seconds intervals to increase the burn and because I am dumb. I was finishing my third sprint session and was beat and sat down on a small wall looking into the blackness of the desert night. By this point I have been outside for at least an hour, and my neighborhood is not brightly lit, so my eyes are fairly well adjusted. As I sat there, I heard some rustling in front of me and said, "Too tired to run, so if you're going to kill me, go for it." I chuckled, figuring it would startle whatever creature was in the brush, but instead I watched a human figure emerge from the shadow. "No harm is intended, simply check your well-being, as you seem distressed," the person said as they walked to the wall and sat looking into the neighborhood. I was caught off guard, and they sat a few feet away on the wall, so I just blurted out, "All good here. I even have a couple titanium walking sticks in case the walk gets dangerous." It was half a threat just in case. Always smart to have protection. Some creatures enjoy easy prey. Stay safe, and you should end your outing early. Just as a precaution, he said this as he stood back up and walked into the neighborhood. As he left, I realized I never heard any footsteps. None when he appeared and was walking on loose dirt and crunchy gravel, and none when he walked away. I shook my head and decided it was a delusion from exhaustion, but went straight home instead of finishing my exercise. The weirdest part is that I checked my neighborhood watch app in the morning, and someone else reported an unusual man in dark clothes asking if they were okay from the same evening. They even noted the person showed up when they took a seat and were resting at the same wall, about an hour or two before my evening walk. I asked him if anything was off about the interaction, and he said, I somehow didn't feel like I was in danger, but something made me extremely alert at the exact same time. Regardless of normal or not, I now bring a super bright flashlight when I walk at night and do a quick flash when I hear a sound. Little girl with deer antlers in the forest. There's a forest near my house. I went for a walk there at night yesterday, and I saw a girl. The girl had deer antlers, a white dress with the skirt part having black polka dots. She has pale skin, blonde hair, and dark blue eyes. I thought I was hallucinating, but she had a shadow, and leaves from the trees fell on her dress and onto the ground. She wasn't moving, she was just staring at me for like 2 to 3 minutes. I stepped forward, then asked, "Hey kid, are you okay?" And suddenly after that I blinked, gone, vanished, disappeared. The leaves that were on the dress then fell to the ground were still there, and I could pick them up, so I know she was solid. After that, I went home. Then I had a dream, today, that the girl was standing next to a demon with smooth skin and a human body but no features like hair, muscles, or anything. It had a deer head, and the head was like the skin was shaping the skull like it was tight. There were bodies next to them. From the perspective of my dream, they were facing me, and I was facing them. I couldn't see the faces or details of the bodies. I woke up after that and had a gut feeling that they were cannibals, or at least the girl was. I don't remember, I just remember waking up and having it's a cannibal feeling. I felt a negative energy from them, I can't explain. I'm really scared right now. Anyone know what it was or why I saw it? I also looked it up, there's no record of anything that looks like it. Ghost by the river. I live in a southeasterly part of Wisconsin, in the suburbs. In my town we have our village park, which sits right on the river, and you can see people fishing there on warm summer days. Leaving the park, you can take a shortcut along a little trail called the Riverwalk, where there are a few different places where there are steps you can go down to be at the edge of the water. It's very pretty actually and very calming to walk along, so I still walk there to this day, except not after it gets dark. Last summer I hung out with this one girl a lot, let's call her Becky, because we only live about 4 blocks away from each other. One of our favorite things to do was go on walks, and every time we hung out we would go on at least one walk, a lot of the time when it was dark out so it wouldn't be as hot out. The village park was one of our usual haunts, and we would go there probably every other day, if not more. This day we stayed out late again, but no one was supposed to be in that particular park by 10 p.m., so right around that time we grabbed our backpacks and started to head out by the Riverwalk. There are no lights on the Riverwalk, but that night it was probably a full moon, or near that, so the moonlight was bright enough to see everything. As we came nearer to one particular set of steps, still talking, I looked at the steps. I vividly remember the first time I looked, no one was there. But the second time I looked, there was a man sitting there and looking at us. My body felt cold as soon as I saw him, and I stopped talking. I froze up, or at least my mind did, and I just continued walking, moving like a robot. I couldn't take my eyes away from the man, and part of what made this encounter so horrifying was his face. That is, his lack of a face. Where his face should have been, there was complete blackness. Yes, it was dark, but the moonlight was bright enough to where I should have been able to see what his face looked like. But it was just dark. I looked at Becky to see if her face had the same effect, but it didn't. My stomach twisted into hot knots until we were far enough away to let go of the breath we had been holding. I asked Becky if she saw the guy, and she described the exact same experience that I had. She was convinced it was a demon, but I think it was only a ghost, or spirit. But no matter what it was, I will never go past that spot at night ever again. Anyone have any ideas what this could have been? I've been looking and asking for years. My experience was almost 40 years ago. I've never heard of anyone else experiencing something similar. I was walking down a pole line in northeastern Pennsylvania with a friend, electrical power lines with a service road along them and woods on either side. It was summer, so the sides of the road were high with brush. As we walked, my friend stopped dead in his tracks and wouldn't respond for a few seconds. Suddenly he turns and runs back the way we came. When he stopped, he said he saw a white stick floating across the path. I believed him because we were close but had no idea what he was talking about. A few months later, we were walking the same road. It was fall, so the brush was all gone so you could see the ground. About 100 yards away, I saw a perfectly white and straight stick floating across the road in a sinusoidal pattern. It came close to the ground but wasn't touching, and it probably went a foot or two off the ground at its highest point. It didn't disturb the tree branches when it entered the tree line. It was so white that it looked like it glowed, but I don't think it was actually producing light or anything like that. I was unable to move or talk while it was on the path and was only able to when it entered the woods. I started running towards it to see what it was. I yelled to my friend as we ran that I saw the walking stick, and he turned around and ran the other way. I gave in and ran with him. A couple years ago, during the pandemic, my brother was smoking out his window, which faced an old garage/gas station and woods. Same town, but probably a mile or two from where we saw the stick. He said that he saw a light fly over the garage and head over the woods and disappeared. He said he then saw a white pole on the roof of the garage going back and forth and changing shape. Details were fuzzy. Last time I asked him about it, he was dismissive and said he thinks it was a telephone pole. He has an intellectual disability but is not a storyteller. I don't think he has the imagination to make something like that up. He's pretty literal with things. Sleepwalking to a stone circle. This happened to a friend's younger brother, Stephen. About 3 miles from their house is an ancient stone circle called the Tyrebagger Stone Circle. It's at the edge of Kirkhill Forest, near Aberdeen, Scotland. Anyway, Stephen, the brother, started having a weird experience. He was 14 at the time. He'd wake up sitting with his back against a tree facing the stone circle, with no idea of how he got there. It was usually just before dawn or as the sun came up. He'd be barefoot with pajamas on. He'd feel confused as to how he got there, naturally. He wasn't physically hurt in any way. Of course he'd look around to see if anyone was there, but there never was, and he'd hot-foot it back home again and get back into bed. He was too embarrassed to tell his parents, but after the third time it happened, he told his sister, who then told me. I was 16 at the time and fascinated by it. I wanted to know all the details, naturally, but he just shrugged his shoulders, saying that he went to sleep and would wake up in the same place and then walk home. It was summer, fortunately, so not too cold. He was a normal teenage boy and interested in football and cars and not much else. He had no idea why he would start sleepwalking. We all assumed this is what was happening, even though he'd never done this before. It happened again about 2 weeks later, and this time he woke up with a small carved piece of wood on his lap. It had a strange symbol on it, and he had no idea where it came from. His sister then told their mother, who was a bit concerned but put it down to sleepwalking and made sure the doors were securely locked at night. The symbols had a triangle, a kind of rough half circle, and some scratches on it that could have been another shape, but I was unsure if that was also part of the symbol. Another 10 days go by before it happens again, and this time a small smooth stone was on his lap. No markings of any kind, but he said that when he picked it up, it felt warmer than it should have. He threw it on the ground, picked himself up, and ran back home. The next time it happened, he woke up when it was still dark, and this time he did feel scared. This time he had a feeling of being watched but couldn't see anything. With the light of the moon, he ran home. Nothing was on his lap this time. For the next 3 nights he had bad dreams about the circle and of a cloaked woman who spoke words he did not understand, but he had a very bad feeling, like he had to get away, and would wake up in a cold sweat. It only happened one more time after that, and again he was sitting with his back against the tree, facing the circle like always. A piece of wood with a symbol in the rough shape of a triangle and some other scratches was on it. He put it in his pocket. He doesn't know why and ran home, wanting to get away from that place. It was just as the sun was coming up. He showed this artifact to his sister and myself. Both of us didn't want to touch it for some reason. Nothing that made sense, just that we didn't want to touch it. This seemed to freak out Stephen a bit, so he threw it on the fire. Nothing ever happened after that. Weird thing when walking my dog. Just to clarify, I don't know what this could be, but if anyone does, I'd like to know, since it could just be something normal, and I just didn't know, but nevertheless, it was creepy. So basically I was walking my dog, an Alaskan Malamute/Japanese Akita. And since my dog is a snow dog by nature and it was snowing at the time, around 3 inches of thick snow, I decided to take him for a walk around the fields that are at the back of my house. Bear in mind that this particular day it was pretty foggy, so visibility wasn't the greatest. Anyway, we got to the field. I usually walk too, and I wanted to let the dog have the lead so it could run around in the snow and roll around and just have some fun in the snow. But as I was about to let it off, I saw what looked like a group of people huddled together. Because I didn't want to scare anyone, as my dog is a big dog and loves people, so it charges at anyone for them to pet it, I decided to keep it on the lead. I was curious though, it was around 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning, so people weren't usually around, especially in groups. I decided to check it out, so I walked closer until my dog just stopped and stared at the group of people. It was baring its teeth and snarling. It also stretched itself forward and laced its front paws far in front of it, almost as though it was going to pounce. That's when I took my first good look at this thing, and it was a huge shock. It was a horse. What's weird and creepy about it though is that for one, there aren't usually horses just hanging around here, especially not completely alone in 3-inch deep snow. And second, the thing didn't have a normal horse head. Usually horses' heads are straight and pointed, kind of like a snout. This one had a completely round face and was staring at me. By this point, I had stepped over my dog and had it between my legs so it didn't charge. I tugged on the lead slightly to try and get it to come back, and it turned around, and we walked away, but the dog kept looking back at that horse thing. I live in central England, so if anyone has similar experiences or even an explanation, then that would be appreciated. This all happened in December 2023, around the 20th. Unexplained phenomena, purple haze and floating light circles. The purple haze. One late afternoon, as I was walking home from the school bus stop, I encountered something I still can't explain. When I reached the end of my driveway, I saw what seemed like a purple haze. It wasn't like mist or fog that reduces visibility. Instead, it was as if the air itself was tinted purple, kind of wispy like smoke. This dense, translucent haze hovered about 10 feet off the ground, covering an area of roughly 30 by 30 feet. It didn't smell like smoke and wasn't affected by the wind, leading me to think it wasn't a natural atmospheric occurrence. I've looked into potential explanations, like airglow or atmospheric scattering, but nothing quite fits what I saw. It felt more like stepping into another dimension where the air was dyed with this royal purple tint. The floating light circles. On another occasion, my mom and I were standing at the end of our driveway late at night when we witnessed something truly astonishing. Suddenly, I saw a circle of light appear in front of me as if someone had turned on a flashlight. But when I turned around, there was no one there, and the light itself seemed to be floating in mid-air. I can't remember exactly how they appeared because I was pretty young, and this happened probably 20 to 25 years ago, but it was a very memorable experience. These were not beams of light like from a flashlight. Instead, they were more like 2D circles, each about 12 inches wide, floating about 4 to 5 feet off the ground. They were white with a slight yellowish color, resembling the illumination of a battery-powered flashlight, before LEDs. They didn't emit light in the traditional sense but instead seemed like lenses that illuminated whatever was behind them. There were 4 or 5 circles in total. A couple of them were kind of playfully bouncing around each other, while the one I was about a foot away from remained still. We lived in the woods, so we had a 300-foot-long driveway to the house, and as we moved up our driveway, the circles followed us, floating silently through the air. I'm pretty sure my mom brought me inside because she was freaked out and got my dad to show him, but when they got back outside, the circles were gone. Both experiences were profound and left me curious about what I saw. Have any of you experienced similar phenomena or have any ideas about what these could be? I'd love to hear your thoughts or any stories you might have. This is the only place I could think to share this. Last summer, I distinctly remember walking past an old neighbor's house to find that a cherry tree had been cut down. I was upset about it because I knew new owners had moved in, and I assumed they cut it down for some reason. I even talked to the owner of the corner store across the street and some regulars who hang out in front of his place about it, and they couldn't believe it either. It's finally warm enough to walk over that way on my normal dog walk, so I did Saturday and realized the tree was still there. I asked the store owner and regulars again, and they looked at me like I had 5 heads. I walked away super confused. There is absolutely no way I would have mistaken this, and I remember my conversation with them from the summer extremely clearly. I lived on that block for 10 years, so I knew it intimately. I tried to just drop it and write it off as a super realistic dream that maybe I mistook for a memory, but nothing even close to that has ever happened before. I've been super confused about it since. Has anyone had anything similar happen? Helen's Bridge. It was right around this time of year 3 years ago when my current boyfriend and I first met. A few weeks later, I went camping on Halloween weekend in the woods right next to the supposedly haunted Helen's Bridge near Tunnel Road in Asheville, North Carolina. It was a beautiful spot up there with so much overlook, and with the bridge being right there with all of the stories we had been told about its hauntings, true or not, it made it just scary enough for a little thrill. I wish I could say Helen's Bridge, as we had planned, was the scariest part about that weekend. Not even close. It was Halloween, and we were planning on going to a show that night. He, my boyfriend, and I planned with each other that I was going to get ready at camp while he walked into town to get some drinks and something to eat before we left. If he didn't make it back before dark, it would not be more than 30 after that. I didn't have any problem with that. I had a lot of experience solo camping and was pretty woodsy. The most that would spook me would be a bear if one happened to wander up. We had chosen an area that was super secluded and more backcountry sort of camping, so it would just be us the whole weekend, more romantic that way. Like usual, it didn't take me long to get ready, and it was super peaceful up there. I knew it was going to be another 45 minutes or so before he got back, so I decided to read a book in the tent with the door open for some air. 10 minutes into reading, I heard a fairly large branch break a couple of feet behind my tent. I had learned how to gauge how large of an animal it might be in the past by the sound they made walking through the woods. This one seems big. A bear. It wasn't quite pitch black out yet, so I got out of my tent, turned around to shout at it to get it to run away, and there stood a huge, probably 6 feet 5 inches 6 feet 6 inches, man. Completely taken off guard and pretty nervous about the situation, without thinking, I said hi. He said hello and walked closer. Looking back, I wish I would not have been so friendly, but it had been a habit. I thought he had just set up camp, probably somewhere nearby, and would just do a quick introduction and retreat. I was horribly mistaken. I don't know if he was saying things trying to get a rise out of me, scare me. I don't know what parts were true, I still don't. He immediately started saying things like, "What's a pretty little thing like you doing alone in the woods all by herself? Don't you know bad things happen to pretty little girls like you?" I ignored him and said I wasn't alone. My boyfriend was right down the hill going to the bathroom and would be heading back. I hoped this would cause him to leave, but instead he said, "What if I told you that I have been watching y'all for a few days now and I know you're lying?" "He's gone for a minute," he said. "What are you hiding out in the woods?" "I'm hiding because I hurt my girlfriend's sister." "I can tell that bothers you." "It bothers you a lot, doesn't it?" My heart sank completely, and with a complete loss for words, I'm fairly certain my stomach was going to fall out of my ass. I was shaking and was hoping he couldn't tell because it was getting darker. I wanted to appear annoyed and calm. I was just annoyed at his existence. I rolled my eyes and grabbed my water bottle to give my brain a few seconds to figure out how to tell him to get the duck away from me. Maybe just that? Yup, let's go with that. When I looked back up to tell him, he had somehow, extremely quietly, gotten significantly closer to me, close enough to punch me in the face, causing me to fall back. I was probably knocked out for only a second, and when I opened my only eye I could, he punched me again and tried to get on top of me. Terrified, I rolled out of the at and just kept rolling until I got up and started running. To where I didn't know. I had no light, no shoes, and no phone. And it was a good mile or so before any neighborhood. I was screaming and could hear him screaming and chasing after me, "You're dead when I catch you. You're so ducked when I catch you." I got a car and hid under it. I didn't see him after that. I was too scared to go anywhere near there, especially at night, so I asked someone in a house I knocked on to use their phone to call the police and my boyfriend. Ironically enough, it turns out the monster's name was Jason. Halloween got entirely too real that year. I had some more weird shit happen one night. I took my 2 dogs for walks. I normally walk Finn, a large, all-black German Shepherd, toward the park where I have had these experiences, and I walk Booger, a Chitter mix, the other direction toward downtown. On my walk with Finn, about a block away in the direction I was headed, I saw 3 or 4 deer calmly walking toward the park. Most nights where something weird happens to me start like this. The deer seemed completely unbothered by me as I approached. They kept walking toward the park but stopped every few steps to look back at me, as if they wanted me to follow them. Then, as Finn and I reached where the deer were, I noticed about 10 or more other deer waiting as well. They all start walking together, calm, but still looking back at me every few feet. On my way toward the park, I smell the stench of rotting meat. I know the smell very well, as I used to be a butcher. It was strong. Like someone plugged my nostrils with rotting ground meat or something. At the same time I smell this stench, I get chills. Finn's hair stands up, and he gets more nervous. I can feel the air around me get colder. As we continue walking, I look down an alleyway that cuts the block in half and, if you would walk down the dark alley, would spot you out where I eventually walk back home. I was 2 blocks away from the park. When you reach the park, you can either turn around and walk down the same road, you can continue into the park, or you can continue on the road that turns left. Looking down that alleyway, you are looking at the part of the road that continues left, which is the way I take every night on my way back home. What I saw I tried to convince myself wasn't real, or maybe I just saw something else and my brain tried to convince me it was this. The creature, large, muscular, pale, and hairless, moved swiftly. So fast I could barely see it. I saw the motion down the alley about 2 blocks away. The exit of the alley on that side has a streetlight directly above it. It wasn't standing still, it was moving, and it was moving fast. The only reason I'm positive what I saw wasn't deer or something normal is because of something I saw later that night that I will write about when I talk about my walk with Booger. It solidified that what I saw was something I wasn't supposed to see. In the meantime, I convinced myself I was making stuff up and being a pussycat. As we approached the tree line of the park, the large group of deer moved to the side of the street where the neighborhood is, while I'm on the side with the tree line. I noticed something in the clearing. A lone deer, separate from the large group across the street, staring directly at me. I have my flashlight pointed at him, and I even hung up my call with my wife to use my phone to take video of this moment. This lone deer doesn't even have micro movements from breathing. The other deer across the street were constantly readjusting. You might be thinking to yourself, oh yeah, deer do that with bright lights shining at them. Deer in headlights always act like that. Just wait. Finn begins to pull with great force and displays signs of anxiety, almost knocking me over. I turn to look across the street toward the large group of deer for at most 3 seconds before quickly turning around to face the lone deer again. In those 3 seconds, that lone deer is easily 30 feet closer to me, still not moving, staring directly at me. I felt weird, I felt unsafe. I've lived in rural Iowa my whole life, I am and have always lived outdoors. This didn't feel normal. I was scared. I back away while shining my light at the deer. Once I get a block or so away, he finally turns around and calmly walks into the tree line. The whole way home, I feel like I'm being stalked, not just watched, but like something is following me. Now, I went home and sat for a bit and tried to talk myself into believing it was all coincidence. After nearly 20 minutes, I started to walk Booger, my smaller chi mix. The entire walk was nice and very enjoyable, actually. I had my earbuds in and was talking to my wife about what I saw in a joking way. Man, I'm such a pussycat, I really scared myself for no reason, I said. At the end of the walk, I turned to go down our alleyway as I leave from the garage on our walks. I stopped speaking from what I saw on the opposite end of the alley. My wife heard me stop. I want to preface this with I did not have any substances, including alcohol, for weeks up to that point. The most I ever do in that department is a few beers, or I'll use some weed to ease anxiety if life is getting hard. I have no mental conditions that will cause me to hallucinate. The most I have is a personality disorder resulting from trauma that I've been overcoming quickly this last year. I saw 2 large, muscular, pale, hairless creatures walking like apes at the end of the alley. The same thing I thought I saw with Finn, this time not going fast, much closer, and it felt intentional. I saw them walk across the street very slowly, staring directly at me. These were not deer. They didn't have long faces like deer, they didn't have fur or tails, and they didn't walk like deer. They weren't slender like deer. My first thought was honestly that I was looking at 2 hairless male lions. In the middle of Iowa. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, well after they had left my sight. 15 seconds later, I finally get the courage to walk the few feet into the garage. When I take my first step, I see a third one. Slowly meandering across the street. Staring at me. Booger noticed him too and started growling. I ran to the door and watched the garage shut all the way. The entire night, Finn guarded the bedroom door. He never does that. He spent the entire night staring at the door. Booger stared at the windows all night. He never does that either. This happened to me on Monday night, May 13, 2024. I don't know what to think. Familiar voice coming from the woods. Back in 2022, me and my dad decided to hike up Mount St. Helens. We hike together all the time, so this is nothing new. In fact, I'm going back for another hike up the same mountain tomorrow. But one thing was different than the rest of the hikes. Mount St. Helens is a little over 4 miles up with about 1 to 2 miles through a wooded area before you start hiking up the rocky open parts. Just as we exited the wooded part and started hiking up the first set of rocks, we heard a voice. The voice screamed "Dad." It sounded exactly like my brother's voice. We had come with my brother because we were on a trip in their area, and this was one of the activities we had planned, but he did not want to come. My brother is out of shape, very unathletic, and hates hiking. Once we heard this voice, me and my dad turned to each other to make sure we weren't hearing things, and sure enough, we both heard it. Without a doubt in our minds, we instantly agreed it sounded exactly like my brother. Since we were 1 to 2 miles in, we knew it was almost definite that he had not come this far. We stayed there for a good amount of time to make sure there wasn't someone behind us, but no one came. No one had passed us coming down for a good amount of time, so it couldn't be that. To make matters worse, fog rolled into this exact area while we were watching for people, so we took no chances and just continued the hike up. We made it to the top and came back down with no more problems. Once we got down, we asked my brother if he had come, and all he said was, "I never left the car." This experience has left a mark in our brains that I and my dad will never forget. Later, we completed the entire hike again with no problems, but everywhere we passed that area, there were always people around, unlike last time. But while we were walking through the forest on the way back, I kept having the distinct feeling of being watched. I never saw anything, so I don't know what it was. I live in Transylvania, Romania, so the woods are never that far away, even in larger cities. Romania also has a large population of brown bears that are a bit more used to humans and usually come out at night. I was walking home from martial arts practice one evening, at around 9 p.m. I was going through a large pedestrian-only area that is pretty wide, 15 meters, around 50 feet, and is surrounded on both sides by 10-story tall apartment blocks. There are spaces between the buildings that you can walk and see through. On the left side of the area, it's a typical Romanian suburban neighborhood, more apartment blocks, 2-lane streets, small parks for children here and there, etc. On the right side there's another 2-lane street, a school, and then a forest, which is about 100 meters or 330 feet away from the buildings at the point where the below happened. At that time of day there are still some people out and about, going to the small stores, relaxing in the cool evening, or doing whatever. Here's the thing, when walking home that night and getting past one of those spaces between the buildings, I got an extremely intense sensation of danger coming from the woods. It was a very unique sensation, different from when you're walking through a dodgy neighborhood and you're on edge, or feeling watched by animals in the woods, or other typical danger instincts. It was a very peculiar and bad feeling that said something like something is out there, relatively close, it is dangerous, and I have to get far away. Not even a gut feeling, but an instinctual and mental certainty that I wasn't safe then and there. The intense sensation itself passed quickly, even if its effect on me didn't, and I walked home very fast after that. For a long time I've categorized it as a paranormal event, some entity that was out in that specific night and emanated some apex predator aura, but after thinking about it recently, I'm wondering if the source was more mundane, a bear. The feeling itself would still be unexplained though because I wasn't paying any particular attention to that side of the area that night and I didn't see, hear, or feel anything physical. It was just a feeling that I haven't felt before or since. 2 will be the first to admit that I'm a sucker for the paranormal, but I don't want to say it's paranormal just so I can feel cool about it. I hope it was, but it's far more likely that there are rational explanations. So I'm curious if anyone else experienced something like this and if anyone knows how one can suddenly feel danger. This happened to me in June 2015 during a bivouac in the Massif de la Chartreuse mountains close to Lyon, France. It does imply a UFO, even if I want to stress that this could probably be a dream or hallucination during a state of sleep paralysis. Nevertheless, I want to talk about it because 1. I think a lot of abduction stories are related to sleep paralysis experiences, and 2. Whatever I say or believe, I keep having this memory come back again and again. To such extent that I am now considering regressive hypnosis. So I like the outdoors. Nature is my church. I have been starting to go on walks alone in the mountains, around 2,000 meter altitude, for 2 to 3 day periods. I travel light. I used to sleep under a tarp but have a very light one-person tent now because I like a minimum of comfort. Last time I had been walking up this mountain for several hours and arrived on a plateau around 1,900 meters. I was planning to walk a lot more, but having left my mountain shoes in the city and being so stunned, I found myself evoking the partially still snowy undergrowth with running shoes. Yep. Stubborn. I decided it was a bit stupid and resolved to settle camp very early, not far from the open part of the plateau, close to a few firs. Lots of traces of animals, but not really in the way I thought it would be a decent, wind-sheltered spot. It was only 5:30 p.m., but the ascension really had beaten me. I also had pretty bad sleep the previous night, so I went straight to cooking and eating my dehydrated rations. I was a bit bummed about not being able to reach my destination and had nothing really to do, as the weather was starting to be a bit chill and gray. I fell asleep very fast around 6:15 p.m., knowing I would probably wake up in the middle of the night. Being so tired, I had a really violent fall into sleep. Having these jolts and jerks thing and being semi-conscious and not really being able to wake up. I did wake up around 10 p.m. because of the cold. I really was ill-equipped, facing 1 degree Celsius temperatures in a 10 degrees sleeping bag, with an extra down jacket but really not nice cold waves all night. Night is dark out there. Black in the woods. Utter. And the silence is deafening. At one point I was starting to fall rapidly into deep sleep again when something made me open my eyes. I could barely half open them because of the drowsiness, but saw a blue light slowly fly next to my tent. I could see it pass through the canvas. Slowly. I was so dizzy but not scared. I was just thinking, oh, there's a blue orb passing by. But suddenly I felt like I was quickly pulled from the ground. I was floating and could feel gravity still pulling on me. Then nothing. I woke up abruptly in the early morning light. My face was facing down on the floor, and I woke up saying, what the hash? Because, you see, sleeping in a tent in extreme conditions is tricky. You have many layers of clothes, then your sleeping bag, and not a lot of space to move. I use a narrow solo tent. I am used to sleeping on my back when camping and stay this way because changing positions is a hassle. You have to move like a worm just to be on your side. Also, I had put my hands in my jacket pockets because of the cold. They were now stuck in there under my belly. I had to move a lot to free them from there and be able to move at all my upper part. What I am saying is that if I had turned over consciously, I would have known it, and it would have taken me a lot of effort and some energy. And how come my hands were still in my pockets? A whole fuss to take them out of there, and I'm not going to turn on my stomach with them in there. So yeah, I was really surprised to wake up like that, and I didn't like the feeling of how the hash did that happen. So in conclusion, I did see a floating blue light and felt I was pulled from the ground and woke up in a weird way. Honestly, it probably all is just due to great fatigue, but I do keep thinking about it and seeing this little blue light. This one happened to me a few years ago when I was in my early 30s. I live in a Southern California coastal town near a major university but close enough to wilderness areas that encounters with skunks, possums, and raccoons are a daily/nightly part of life. I had a somewhat timid pit bull. A past housemate locked himself out of the house and had to break in. When he finally got back in, he found my dog hiding under a table crying, who sometimes demanded late-night walks before bed. Her favorite route was near my house around a large local park along a key thoroughfare between a shopping hub for the local community and the university. The park is sporadically lit and home to critters and occasionally transients. It's also, due to one of those weird flukes of weather and geography, always several degrees colder than the surrounding areas and sometimes home to spooky-ass ground fog. So on this particular fall evening a few years back, my dog and I were walking around the park at about 11 p.m. We approach one of the poorly lit sections of the park exterior, which has high bushes separating the sidewalk from the parking lot and or park itself. The bushes are right on the edge of the sidewalk and about arm's length in width. All of a sudden, my dog starts freaking out. Like full-on attack mode with deep barking and snarling. This was completely out of nowhere, no rustling noises or anything else you would expect to evoke that kind of reaction, and totally uncharacteristic for her. Typically, when she spotted a raccoon or skunk, she was more curious about the weird animal in front of her than anything else, or she would start loudly crying and embarrassing herself. But she almost never flipped out. I immediately yank her away from the bush and run down the sidewalk, thinking, oh SHT, we're about to be skunked. After 25 yards or so, I turn around, pull out my pocket flashlight, the dog still freaking out in the meantime, and shine it back toward the bush, expecting to see a critter saunter away slowly. Instead, we see a man emerge from what I later found out was a hollowed out section of the bush on the other side of the sidewalk. He very casually stood up and looked at us. He looked to be in his late 30s/early 40s and was quite clearly not homeless. He was dressed like a suburban dad, jeans and windbreaker, and appeared to be completely sober. I remember noticing that he was wearing dress shoes and fixating on how out of place it seemed. A bit of background info: I am a big dude, somewhere in the ballpark of 6'8" plus 320 pounds, and I spent a number of years moonlighting as a bouncer at a local bar, so I can spot a drunk pretty easily. After the initial shock of what I was seeing wore off, I mustered my best scary bouncer voice and shouted, "What the duck do you think you're doing?" While my dog was still going apeshit. The guy took off running at a full sprint toward my neighborhood. I called the police. There's a sheriff's substation at the shopping center less than a mile away, and explained what I had just seen. For the rest of our walk, multiple police cars were patrolling the park and the neighborhood with spotlights shining the entire time. From what I understand, they never found the guy. I have no idea what he was doing in the bushes or what would have happened if somebody other than me and my dog had walked by. The bush was uprooted a few years ago, but I still think about it every time I walk on that side of the park. This happened in Warren, Michigan, on 13 miles by Groesbeck Road. I was about 20 or 21 years old. I had made some friends at my job. I always got along with guys better than I did with girls. I grew up with 3 brothers, so that is probably why. Plus, guys are better to deal with than girls. Less drama. Anyhow, I was hanging out with one of my coworkers and also my friend, Nick. It was a nice, warm summer night. We went to a park, and we laid out on the grass. It was late at night, probably like 10 p.m. No one was at the park but us. At the end of the park was a preschool or kindergarten that was fenced in with a playground. We laid out on the grass, stared out into the clear sky filled with stars, and just talked. You ever have that person when you talk all of a sudden hours go by? Well, that is what happened. All of a sudden it was 2 or 3 a.m. We were surprised at how time flew by so fast. We decided to leave. As we got up, I looked towards the preschool's playground. On top of the slide, I saw a little boy. He looked gray and pale, probably like 6 to 7 years old, standing on top of the slide in winter clothes, staring our way. The little boy just stood there. I noticed in my peripheral vision that Nick was looking in the same direction. I asked him if he sees a little boy on top of the slide. He said yes. We slowly turned around. I told him not to show any fear and to walk slowly. When we were halfway to the car, I said run, and we bolted out of there and drove off. I have not been back since, although I have often wanted to go back just to see if the little boy is still there. I later heard that a boy died on that slide and got choked to death. The strings on his hoodie got stuck somehow as he was sliding down and choked him to death. Now I do not know if this is true or not because it's kind of hard to believe that the strings could choke a little boy out. However, the truth is, Nick and I saw that little ghost boy on top of that slide. It did make me sad to think that little boy is stuck on that slide and hasn't passed on, but I hope the little boy will find peace one day and move on. If the story is true about the little boy dying on that slide, I couldn't help but wonder if the parents know their little boy's spirit is still there. It might be a little weird to think that. I don't know. Late night searching. This happened a few years ago, about when I just turned 14. There was this dog who always would escape their owner's home. They were a dachshund. One day the dog was in my yard when I got home from school. At the time I had no idea who the owner was or where the dog came from, and I wanted to make sure he stayed safe. My mom and I debated for a small while, and we decided to just keep him until we could find the owner, and because of his color, we named him Coffee for the time being. So every day I let Coffee out to use the bathroom. Most of the time I would let him out in the afternoon to use the bathroom, and most of the time he never came back, and being the kind-hearted young man I am, I always went out before or when it was dark to find him. It didn't take me long to realize that he would take a specific path to get to what I now assume is his owner's house. But because at the time I wasn't really sure that it was his owner, I would take him back to my house. So one night, I went out of my house and called Coffee's name. And like usual, he didn't come back, so I decided to go find him. I took the route that I knew I would find him, which was to take a right on the road right in front of my house and to take the first right, then Coffee was usually right by the stop sign down that road. So without much notice, I just left my house and started walking down the road. As I get around halfway to where I'm supposed to turn, I start to hear guys talking about some controversial gay stuff. I don't understand why men wear all that makeup, it makes no sense. Yeah, I don't think men should wear purses and, foggy memory. Now I myself am gay, but I'm a pretty chill guy and understand that people have their own opinions, and that's okay. Still though, the conversation makes me feel a little weird. As I got closer to the two guys, one of them spoke to me. "Hey baby." One of the men said as if trying to assert dominance, trying to make me feel as though they are of higher value than me. I froze in my tracks and slightly glared at the men. They were on the opposite side of the street. Because the only light source at the time was the moon and the street lamp at the point where I was supposed to turn, I wasn't able to see the men very well. I was able to make out that one of them was wearing a cap, and the other man was bald. Both of them were smoking, and I was able to tell that they were drinking. "Hey baby," the man in the cap said again in the same tone. The bald man immediately lets out a chilling, dry laugh that struck me with a slight fear and left me feeling uneasy. A little startled but mostly confused, I didn't say anything to the men. "Are you looking for your dog?" the man in the cap said in a low tone, again accompanied by his friend's chilling laugh. Though the pit in my stomach grew, I somehow got the courage to finally speak. Yeah," he ran away again. I spoke in a surprisingly calm tone. "I see you come out here every night." This comment made the pit in my stomach grow, because I know for a fact that every time I come out to find Coffee, the men in the truck that accompanied them were never once at that house. He continues talking about things I can barely remember. All I can remember is the bald guy chuckling as he speaks to me. As the man continues talking to me, I slowly walk away from the men, nodding, acting like I'm pairing their minds. Soon the man stopped talking to me and wished me luck on finding my dog. I finally get to my turn, and I kid you not, the moment I walk under the streetlight, it bursts. At this point I'm internally freaking out and not entirely able to think clearly, but somehow I'm able to keep relatively calm. Stupidly, I didn't bring my phone because the route to find coffee was really short, so I didn't think I would need it. I finally got to where coffee usually is and even whispered his name a few times, but to my surprise, he didn't come. I was debating what route I should take to get back to my house. There was another way to get back that didn't involve seeing those men again, but it's extremely dark and woodsy where I live, which means that there was a good chance I would bump into wildlife. So I ended up deciding to go back the way I came, which was the shorter route anyway. But this time I ran through people's front yards stealthily and carefully. I passed by the men who hadn't seemed to move from when I first saw them. I finally got to my front yard, and I decided to look back at where the men were. They just got in their truck and went all the way down the road I was on. I rush inside and immediately tell my mom what happened. She was slightly concerned but just told me not to go back out at night again. Not too long after this, my mom called me and told me that she found out that there was one man residing in that home who was a registered pedo. My mom urged me to not go back out at night or by myself again. I agreed. I'm 17 now and have my driver's license, and I do still live in the same small town where this incident took place. I drive by that house where I see the men every time I go out to get groceries. The weird thing is that there is never anyone at that house. Sadly, I don't know what happened to Coffee. I never found him after that night. And I still think of that night from time to time, thinking what would have happened if I was younger or didn't play my cards right. Or why exactly did that street lamp turn off the moment I walked under it? It was my friend's 17th birthday. He's really into camping and various other outdoor activities. I was invited along with a few other friends, but it was a busy time of the year before graduation, and only 4 of us ended up going. My friend, his 13-year-old brother, his brother's friend, and myself. We camped at a lake a few kilometers out of town, a little bit into the woods. The spot we camped in was a small clearing. It wasn't an actual official camping spot, but it worked well nevertheless. We ended up having to cut our own firewood from nearby trees. We didn't want to, but my friend forgot firewood. I don't know how he did, and we didn't have any cell service where we were. If you've ever cut down trees with smaller camping saws and hatchets, you'd know it. Takes a while, even when there were 4 of us. Over around 4 hours we acquired quite a collection of firewood, so when the sun started to set, we got hungry and wanted a fire. The fire took an hour to start. Thanks to the rain that morning, the wood was very damp. Eventually, with the help of some hand sanitizer in my backpack and the wood drying out from our other attempted fires, we got a decent fire going. I remember being really relieved. We were really hungry and managed to cook up some hot dogs, bacon, and marshmallows, the usual camping food. We had been exhausted from the day of cutting down small trees, so we retired to our large tent pitched in the clearing. We fell asleep very fast. But around 2 in the morning I woke up from a really cold and loud wind. I remember struggling around in my sleeping bag, trying to find a comfortable position, or trying to stay warm. I ended up just lying in bed for what seemed like hours unable to sleep until suddenly, I heard a loud snapping of a branch, which I just put off as a bird or another animal like a raccoon or deer. I mean, we were in the middle of the forest, so it made sense at the time. Anyway, around 3 minutes later, I heard it again, but just a little closer. I thought about waking my friend or his brother up, but being me, I didn't want to be rude and wake them up just in case it was just an animal. That's when I heard distinct footsteps. They sounded maybe 10 or 15 feet away. At this point, a chill ran up my spine, and my stomach turned. I instantly thought, what if it's a cougar or a bear? As I live in West Coast Canada, so it's not uncommon. Nevertheless, I was a little scared. Now it is worth noting that my friends and I all had decent-sized knives on us, along with various other sharp objects, like our hatchet and compound bow. At this point I kept hearing these footsteps very slowly, so I armed myself with my knife and put my friend's hatchet through my belt loop. I slowly unzipped the tent, slipped my shoes on, and decided to check it out. That probably wasn't the best choice looking back on it now, but I was trying my best to be brave. Gripping my knife, I creeped outside into the cold night. For a minute I searched around the tent, finding nothing. I made the decision to take a pill. After I was done, I started back towards the tent when I heard another branch snap. Trying not to be loud, I called out, "Who's there?" No response. I started to walk towards the sound, and when I saw the dark silhouette of a large, what looked like a middle-aged man, I panicked. "What the duck? Who are you?" I called out. The man's position shifted towards me before he turned around and sprinted off down the trail towards the parking lot. I stood there shocked for a minute. I didn't sleep that much that night, waking up constantly. In the morning I told my friend, his brother, and his brother's friend. They were shocked by this, but my friend's brother told me around 1 in the morning, he also heard footsteps and branches. Who knows what that man's intentions were for 4 teenagers camping in the woods? Maybe he was on drugs, or another camper nearby, which I really doubt. What creeps me out the most about this incident is that in the area where he was standing, which I checked in the morning, I found my friend's brother's sweater on the ground, which he claimed he never put there, and I don't think the wind moved it there. So, weird older woods guy, let's never meet again. I grew up in the Ozarks, at the edge of Mark Twain National Forest, which, for those less in the know, is a 1.5 million acre forest in the Midwest. It was ironically not unusual to spot or hear things you wouldn't normally hear in the woods in this part of the country, such as mountain lions and wolves. In fact, our experts here said there was no way we had any of those, which we locals vehemently disagreed with. There is no mixing up mountain lions and wolves with bobcats and coyotes. Anyway, my car had broken down a few months prior to this particular experience, so I was left hitching rides with coworkers or walking the 4 miles home, along winding roads that primarily wound through the woods. On one such night, I opted to take a trail my brother told me about, which was about halfway along the highway route home. I was pretty comfortable in the woods at night. The majority of wildlife living along the highway was deer, squirrels, and other such small and, mostly, harmless critters, and up to that point I had never seen anything more concerning than certain varieties of snakes, bobcats, and coyotes. When I had entered the woods, there was still a little light on the horizon, but that all but disappeared when I entered the tree line. I felt committed, so I continued on my way, staying alert and using my phone for light when needed. I had been walking for about 10 minutes when I got this feeling something was watching me. I stopped and listened closely, but the only thing I could hear was crickets and tree frogs. I walked a few more steps, and then every hair on my body stood up. I still don't know what tipped me off, but I knew something wasn't right, so I very slowly pulled out my phone and turned on my flashlight. I shined it around me until I caught sight of a huge set of eyes. It only stayed for a couple seconds, but it was clear I was staring at a mountain lion, very distinctive facial features compared to a bobcat. I made myself as big and scary, or stupid, looking as I could and started screaming at the top of my lungs. It was gone by the time I started making noise, but it made me feel better knowing I was probably making it add distance between us. I ended up cutting through the woods back to the highway and stayed with that until I got home. It was around this time people in the area had started reporting seeing a mountain lion, including my mom and then me again a few months later while taking my brother to his girlfriend's house. I have several more stories I may have to tell on here sometime. This was fun. A walk with my grandmother. When I was younger, my grandmother couldn't really talk. She had had a stroke plus was suffering from Alzheimer's. She could talk, but most of the time she would make this humming noise, if that makes sense. We had to do everything for her, feeding her, cleaning her up, washing her, etc. But I will say that my family did try to include my grandmother in family events. Towards the end of her life, we bought her a wheelchair. My experience with her happened when I was very, very young. I must have been 6 or 5 years old. One day, me and her were alone at home. The aunt that was supposed to be watching us both had run to go do a quick, urgent errand. Plus, our other family lived close by. Anyway, I was reading a book when I heard my name spoken so very clearly. And in that same instant, I heard something like, "Come, let's take a walk." I don't think I recognized the voice at first. Like I said, my grandmother didn't really talk. Important note here, she spoke the first word, "come," but the other ones I remember just picking up on. I cannot say I know what that means, really, but that is what my experience was. I asked, "Walk to where?" And my grandmother, who tended to shuffle more than actually walk, was walking upright towards me with a hat. It was one of those black church hats, I think. My grandmother told me, "It's just up the road and back. Don't you want to come?" So, we both left the house and were walking up the road together. Looking back, it was very weird that there was no one out to see us or that none of the neighbors saw my grandmother walking by herself without assistance, because our neighborhood is very tight-knit. My grandmother grew up with most of the people in our stretch of road. It was even weirder because my grandmother was talking normally throughout that trip. I think it was a one-sided conversation because my grandmother was really a stranger to me. I never grew up with her healthy, unlike everyone else in the family. Anyway, as we got to the top of the road, my aunt was driving through with her car. She saw us, and I swear to God, my grandmother instantly reverted. I had to try to keep her standing upright with my little body. My aunt asked me why I was outside, and I told her that my grandmother said we should go for a walk. My aunt didn't believe me. She said my grandmother was just mad and that I should know better than to listen to her, etc. But that was the end of that. Far as I can tell, nothing like that ever happened again. I know that sudden bouts of lucidity can sometimes happen with Alzheimer's, but that really doesn't explain how I heard her voice in my head when her mouth wasn't moving. I grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, a semi-small city with a low crime rate, at least back in the day when I was 14. It was such a quiet, nice city that almost nobody locked their doors. People would say hi to each other on the street. You could pretty much go to anyone's house for dinner and your parents wouldn't be too nervous about it, etc. And you could walk home by yourself at night from your middle school basketball game without fear. Which is what I was doing this particular night. It had been a long game and went later than normal, and my parents had to both work in the morning so they didn't go, which was fine. They went to all my other games, so they could get to bed early. It was an 8-minute walk from my middle school to my house, so there were no concerns about my safety. So I'm walking, right? I'm wearing a pink sweater and jeans over my basketball jersey. My hair is a sweaty mess, but I was in a good mood because it was a good game. So I was walking in a relaxed fashion, unconcerned and unaware. And that's when I felt it. I can't explain how I knew, but I just knew I was in some sort of danger. I looked around me, and parked near the blacktop fence was a Jeep with its lights off. I ducked my head and walked away from it, hoping that I didn't catch their attention. No such luck, the Jeep followed me. It pulled up next to me, and I saw the window open and I ducking booked it. Didn't look back, just ran. I felt a strong negative emotion toward that Jeep. I didn't stop until I could see my parents' house, and I thought I was safe. Just as I stopped to catch my breath, I heard an engine rev behind me, and that same Jeep was tearing down the street, beelining towards me. I was in a position where I couldn't run anywhere safe in time, big open space near the road, so I just stood there frozen in terror. I was backing up and must have looked every bit the victim with my sweaty hair and white face, because just as the Jeep pulled up near me and the door opened, some old guy across the street yelled something. I don't even know what the guy said, but the Jeep's door slammed shut, and it peeled away. I didn't even thank the guy, which I feel bad about, because he might have just saved me from something horrible. I just ran home. I threw myself inside and slammed the door behind me, scaring the shit out of my mom, who was just heading to bed. When she asked me what's wrong and I told her, she woke up Dad. We considered calling the police, but since I didn't have a facial description or a license plate, there wasn't much to give them. All I knew was that it was a dark Jeep, and it chased me. That night, my parents never let me walk home from school again. A week later, the newspaper said that there had been a bad incident of a young woman at a nearby parking garage 5 minutes from my house. And a Jeep was mentioned. This might not be super scary to some, but at the moment it happened, I was pretty freaked out. I was walking my dog on the path that runs along the shore of the river near my place. It's in the city, but there's a drop to reach the path, and the nature is pretty dense, even in winter with long types of grasses still standing up through the snow as tall as me in some areas, so it feels quite isolated. I let my dog loose there, and she runs way ahead of me, but I regularly see her pop out of the vegetation, back in view down the winding path. I'm not scared of losing her, as she's pretty well trained and knows to stay close to the path. I particularly leave her to explore all she wants when we're heading back home, like we were at this point, whereas whenever we're on our way the opposite direction, walking away from home, I try to work on her recall regularly with the help of treats. Anyway, a little while ago I turned around to take a picture, and I noticed a man hiking far behind us. I like to take pictures there as it's beautiful, and it really doesn't feel like we're in the city anymore. But I soon forgot about the hiker and just walked ahead, taking in the beauty and fresh air. We finally get to the point in the path that's closest to my place, so I call back my dog in order to leash her. She looks super cute with her giant, dangly legs and her ears bouncing as she runs towards me, so I decide to take out my phone one last time to take a picture of her, but she's actually going really fast, and I realize I won't have the time to take a good one. As I go to put my phone back in my pocket, she just whizzes straight past me, and I turn around to call her again, but the man who had been hiking far behind us before was suddenly just 2 meters from me. My dog stopped right in front of him, barking her super low, growly bark of a Great Dane that even freaked myself out the first time I heard it. The guy and I exchange a look. He's like a deer in the headlights. After a few seconds of us just being frozen in place, I try calling back my dog again, and thankfully she listens to me, because I was a bit scared of what she could do if she wanted to. As I leash her up, I still try to keep my phone in my hand so I can call 911 if the guy somehow made a move, but he's just totally still. Then we climb up the mound toward the park, away from the shoreline, and I realize the hiker might not have noticed I had a dog with me. He was just slowly catching up on me all this time, and it was getting pretty dark even though it was only late afternoon. It's winter in Canada, and it can be pitch black down that path as early as 5 p.m. sometime. Maybe he was simply catching up on me because he walked faster, or maybe it was very intentional, I'll never know for sure. But for me not to notice he was so close behind me, he must have been planting his feet in the snow at the exact same pace as me. Anyway, I'm sure glad I had my giant dog with me. Late night walk, stopping in a park to see the stars and heard a ghost runner. So on Friday 9th February, I went out for a late night walk around my neighborhood. It was a clear night, so I was looking up at the sky for a lot of the time. After a while, as I was making my way back home, I saw a couple of bright lights heading in opposite directions. One was traveling east and the other west. I speculated to myself that they were probably satellites, possibly Starlink, but I don't know. There's a local park near my place, so I decided to stop by there to check out the night sky as I tend to do and see if I could see any other satellites. I walked through the grass to the small playground where there sits a wooden picnic table and jumped on it to get a better view. I stared looking up at the night sky for a while, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I was able to spot a few moving stars, presuming them to be satellites like the earlier bright lights I had witnessed. So as I stood there on top of the park bench looking at the northern sky, I heard coming from my left side the sound of someone jogging or running quickly towards me through the grass. In that moment I was thinking to myself they would either greet me and continue on their way or maybe ask what I was doing and if they could sit there. So turning around, I was fully expecting to see someone. But to my astonishment, I saw no one. I thought to myself, okay, that's weird, and turned to look up again at the sky. Once more, I heard the sound of running. I turned again, thinking it might be an animal, but once more the sound suddenly stopped, leaving me looking about me in a confused state and further afield towards the trees and neighboring houses. But I couldn't discern anything near or far. I actually started thinking to myself whether someone was using an invisibility cloak or something along those lines. Crazy, I know, right? As I was adamant it sounded exactly like someone was running near me, but I just couldn't see them. Starting to feel a little creeped out now, a couple minutes later I decided to go home. As I walked through the park, I was looking around me to see if I could see any animal that had been the source of the sound, but again, I could see nothing. I've lived almost 40 years in the area and have visited this local park on numerous occasions, day and night, but this was the first time I've ever experienced something bizarre like this. I have no idea if any adult or child has died at the park in the past. Suffice to say, when I arrived back home, I shared my experience with my family, and my sister speculated maybe it's haunted while one of her daughters exclaimed, "There has to be a logical explanation," while the other daughter now wants to join me the next time I head out on one of my late night walks. More backpacking than a walk, but this ducking terrifies me to this day. Our planned camping spot for the night was full. We'd backpacked all day to get to that location, and there wasn't anywhere close to set up our tents. We called our guy on the outside to come pick us up as it was getting late. We didn't have anywhere to set up camp, and a storm was approaching. We hiked to the nearest exit point on the trail, met our pickup guy, and he drove us a few miles to the nearest campsite we were familiar with that we could basically drive up to. Long logging path, pretty deep in the mountains that we had hiked to in previous years, so we were kind of familiar with the area. Anyways, we hop out of the van, and it's pitch black out. No moon, it's April in the mountains and still pretty chilly. We're cold, hungry, and exhausted. That's when we notice this mother ducker staring at us from behind a tree. We notice this guy, no headlamp, no equipment, no backpack, just standing there. One of our group members, a former Marine, yells at him to come out and explain what his deal is. This guy walks a few feet out from behind the tree, and we all shine our lights on him, and I shit you not, this dude's white t-shirt is covered in what looks like blood smears. He's pretty rough looking, has long hair, a long beard, and crazy eyes, and he was wearing a bloody t-shirt and shorts in 35-degree weather at night. We're all pretty freaked out, and this is a quite experienced group of hikers who've seen some shit. We ask this guy what his deal is, and he says we can't camp here. We tell him that that's exactly what we plan to do, and he says, "I don't think that's a good idea for any of you." We kind of turn to discuss as a group, and when we look back, he's hidden back behind the tree. As a group, we basically decided none of us were getting any sleep that night if we stayed here, so we packed up the van and left. As we were pulling out, this guy pulled out one of those red filtered flashlights and ran after our van. I'm not kidding, he followed us for at least a quarter mile on foot. He was quick as duck. We passed a park ranger on the road and flagged him down to tell him how weird that dude was acting, and he said he'd go investigate. I didn't hear anything about it again for 5 years. For the longest time, I thought he was probably some pot farmer who had a nearby plot or a moonshiner who was just living in the woods and didn't want us near his still. People hunt all the time out there, which would maybe explain the blood a little bit. But I was recently at an event with some of those guys again for the first time in years, and that creepy dude from the woods got brought up. One of them who still lives nearby broke out his phone and said, "I forgot to tell you guys, I saw him again." Pulls up a news article, and there he was. So obviously, it's the same guy. He'd been arrested for ending some poor girl on the trail. Timelines didn't match up, so I fully believe we saw this guy shortly after he'd ended someone else. He hasn't been charged with anything else, as far as I'm aware. I'm not backpacking without a gun anymore. I will never walk in the woods after dark. I live in a village out in the woods. As a child, I heard a lot of stories about the monsters that live in the forest and how I shouldn't wander too far. It's always been fairly obvious to me that they were more there to keep me from staying out too late than actual warnings. As I've grown older, I found that the forest was a great place to wind down, especially at night. There's something about the silence that's so calming to me. It's dark, the air is fresh, and I'm alone. It was pitch black outside when I was out on a usual path that I take through the forest. It was cold enough that I kept my hands in my pockets, but it wasn't so chilly as to bother me. The walk was about 20 minutes, and I was 3 minutes in. I couldn't hear anything. Usually I'd hear the buzzing of the lights shining on the dirt road or the wind blowing against my ear, but not tonight. I heard nothing but for my breath and my shoes against the dirt. A bad feeling grew in my gut, and every few seconds I looked back, but I only saw the empty road still as ice. I looked to the side, into the dark forest. The lights shining on the dirt road were so strong that they created an effect, making the darkness of the forest that much more black, like a void that kept on going forever. A terrible feeling grew in my gut. Every few seconds I looked back, but I only saw the empty road. I looked to the side into the dark forest. The darkness covered everything. It was like a void in which anything could stand. A hungry wolf, or perhaps a mad man. It was completely ordinary. But I felt watched. It was an itch in the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. I knew it was completely illogical, but my gut told me to stay on guard. It told me that something was up. Every few seconds I jerked my head back to see if anything had jumped out of the woods and started running towards me. I couldn't help gluing my eyes to the darkness of the woods, ready to see something, anything. I stumbled, my foot hitting up against a large brown root reaching over the road. It had been so sudden. I felt energy spike up through my body. That simple stumble had sent me into a state of panic. But it was brief, and I couldn't help but blame myself for being paranoid. I'd done this at least 1,000 times. Nothing had gone wrong then. Not even the first time I was surrounded by darkness did I feel this scared. What was so special about tonight that my gut felt this way? I kept thinking about that and I kept looking around. I wasn't scared enough to start running, even though a large part of me eagerly wanted to. That would just be too insane. The next 10 minutes of my walk, each single sound or movement, sent me into a panic, and when I saw an oddly large tree just beside the road, I stared at it like my life depended on it. It was an oak tree as thick as 5 humans. Its skin was filled with many different cracks. I spotted small cuts in it, vertical slashes, as if somebody had held a knife, practiced cutting. There were 5 of them. I couldn't help but imagine what was behind the tree. In my mind, I saw a naked, ghostly white figure that would shriek when I saw it and rush at me with rage. But I knew it was my fear speaking. I'd walk past and see nothing. As I walked on the side of the street the furthest away from the tree, I was about to release the breath stuck in my lungs, but I was a hideous man standing there with a wide grin on his face and eyes that jerked into mine, and I saw his smile grow wider as he took one large step towards me, and my heart jolted for the 50th time. I only saw him for a fraction of a second, but that image is stuck in my mind. The man's face was too large for his features. His eyes, nose, and mouth were mere pricks on the giant skin of his face. I remember that he'd cut off his right ear completely and that there was only a small hole there. He was completely bald, and the wrinkles on his forehead reached up far, almost to the middle of his head. I remember seeing his eyes. They weren't cold, dead eyes but ones filled with energy and life, as if this was the most exciting moment, something he'd waited for a very long time and worked very hard to attain. As I was running, I remember glancing back to see his face filled with rage. He was large and fat, and I heard his steps thumping against the dirt path as he ran behind me with a knife raised high. He didn't expect things to turn out like this. I don't think I've ever in my entire life run so fast. The pain was gone. The exhaustion too. My legs moved on their own. Something instinctual took over. Something that had dwelled inside of me since the beginning finally showed its face. I heard him behind me. For 5 minutes I heard him behind me. Sometimes I ran under lights that had broken, and the dirt road turned pitch black, and it was the scariest then. I heard his heavy breathing. He screamed. It wasn't anger but more frustration. There were no words in it. Just a beastly, animal roar. I glanced back to see that he'd stopped. He just stopped, turned around, and walked straight off the path and into the forest in the middle of the night. I didn't stop running until I was home. I slammed shut my door and locked it, trying the handle to make sure that it was stuck. I heard my heart deafeningly throbbing in my ears. When the fear left me, I fell down on the ground, gasping for air. I realized then where those stories had come from. I refuse to walk anywhere alone now. I live in a small village in the middle of Oklahoma, and you can walk from one end to the other in less than 2 hours. One day back in 2019, beginning of my senior year of high school, I decided to walk home from school instead of getting a ride from a friend or my girlfriend. Anyway, it's only a 2-mile walk from my school to my home on the other side of the village. I was walking on the main two-way road that mostly goes uphill. It was a hot day, so I was sweating. I was cursing at myself for not getting a ride from a friend and being so stupid to walk 2 miles in 100 degrees. That's when a car pulled over and waved me over. The car looked familiar. I'd seen it around the school a few times. I thought it was one of my friends, so I rushed over, and the passenger side door swung open. I looked in, and it was a middle-aged, balding man. He asked me, "Hey kid, need a ride?" I kindly declined, saying, "No thanks, I can walk," and I waved him off. He didn't seem so thrilled with that response. With a slightly more aggravated tone, he asked me again, "Hey, kid. Do you need a ride? It's hot as duck." Again, I tell him, "No thanks, dude. I already said that." That was when he opened his door and told me, "Get the duck in the car." I felt a fear I'd never felt before. I slammed the passenger door shut, threw a rock at him to get him to stay in his car, and I started to sprint towards traffic. He was yelling and cursing at me while I tried to wave down another car. No cars stopped, but once I put at least 25 yards between me and him, he slammed his door and sped off. I ran, and ran for 30 minutes, out of breath, to a restaurant on the side of the road and burst in. The lady behind the counter looked so concerned and called the police. I made a report, and the cops drove me home. Now you'd think that would be the last I'd see of the guy, right? No. I saw him at least a dozen more times around the town. He recognized me and would always give me a dead stare and a scowl. He got arrested a few weeks after the last time I saw him. I was there when it happened, but his eyes were so menacing, like he wanted to kill everyone he saw. It turned out he was a convicted felon and was wanted for murder and kidnapping. I'm thankful I never got in that car. I'm thankful he never chased me. I'm thankful he gave up. Creepy forest near my house. Near my house is a forest. It looks small. I've only been there once. With the kids I knew in my block, there was a tale or story of sorts that surrounded the place back then. If you know, if you see, don't go too far, for if you do, the man made of wood will get you. He is made from the trees, his eyes are made with greed, for if you see him late at night, run, run, run. It was a creepy tale, I never cared for. I was a good kid, for if you knew me back then, I was different from the boys in my town. I was kind of like that perfect girl, because for one, I had light blonde curly hair. I hated most sports. I liked art, singing, and stories. I was very kind and trustworthy but gullible, and I was made fun of that I was a girl. That all took place to begin with when I was 8. Me and this girl from my block were playing in her trampoline. We got bored, so we were telling scary stories. Little did I know she had something up her sleeve as she got her older brother, whom I had never met, to dress in a clown costume. So as she told me this story, she said, "I had an uncle that went to prison because he killed kids." Next to the trampoline there was a small alleyway where her brother ran out holding a butter knife. Back then I thought it was a real knife, so I ran, and he chased me and pretended to run after his sister. When I hid behind a wall and peered, I saw that he was standing over her with blood all over her shirt. I later found out it was fake blood. He looked up and chased after me. I ran and hid behind a building and ran and saw an opening in the fence that connects to the forest. I crawled into the forest and ran behind a bush, waiting and listening for him. I heard him run past. I peeked and watched him peek into the forest, and then he ran off to find me, presumably. I looked around and walked deeper into the forest. This was the first time I had ever been in the forest. I made it to a clearing that had wood stumps placed, like seats around a fire. I sat down on one of them and sighed, and I wiped my forehead and looked around, wondering why this all happened. Suddenly I hear the brother walking towards me, so I dove headfirst behind a bush. I heard him pass by. I turned around and jumped in shock. There, nestled into the bramble and bush, was a wooded man. The man stood like a soldier in attention. He was smiling. His eyes looked like they were staring at me but also hollow, like its soul was sucked out. I stood up, then I heard it. I heard whispers. At first they were nearly silent, then they grew. The whispers were of children. Then, like a man with a deep, manly voice, it said, "Hey little girl, it looks like you're not having fun." As soon as I heard that, I thought they were talking to someone else, but the whispers kept talking to me. My voice still scared, I said out loud, "Who's there?" I looked around terrified. "Oh, you're a boy, well, that's just as good, you want to play a game?" I looked around. "Who is it? Where are you?" "Why, I'm right in front of you." But in front of me was the wooden man. I looked closely, and it had changed. Its hands were closed, and its eyes were wider. It had now spawned a wild look. This made me terrified. "Well," the voice rings out, with a hint of playfulness. I looked at the figure, then around me. I said quietly, "No, thanks." Then the wind howls, and I hear "too bad." Suddenly the wooden man began shaking before it took a step, and I realized it wasn't made of wood, it was a man. "Haven't you heard of the tale?" I stood in fear as the man painted to look like would walked closer. Suddenly, the adrenaline of being able to run hit me again, and I bolted out to the clearing. There I saw the girl and the brother of the girl. They were sitting on the wooden stools board waiting for me. When they saw me, they froze, and as they saw the man behind me, I immediately hid behind the brother, who raised his butter knife. The man grabbed it off him with ease and pushed him to the ground. The man smiled an unhinged smile. Before going to grab me and the girl rushed towards the opening of the fence. The girl's brother bolted out with us. As we passed the clearing, we looked back. The man stood still like a statue, still looking at us. We ran to our respective homes and told our parents, who called the police. The police searched where we said the man was, but there was only the butter knife and a wooden statue of a man, standing like a soldier at attention. Now you wouldn't think it was true if it only happened once when I was that age. When I was 15 last year, I had forgotten what happened, and I went into the forest with one of my close friends. We walked exactly to where the wooden stools were. I sat at the stool while my friend went to pee, then I heard him scream, and rushing into the clearing, behind him was an enclosing shadow that came closer with purpose. It was him, I don't know, but I recognized him, and I ran, with my friend, out of the forest. I don't know, but all the memories flooded back in my mind. The same thing happened with the police, they didn't find him. I fear someday he won't be stopping by the fence. Next time a poor soul crosses him. My scariest walk home. Where I live only has an entrance, and the exit was the entrance, and my house was far in the back from the entrance, which means I have to walk about 1 mile to my bus stop. And now to the story. I was 12 years old when this happened, and my bus was getting to my bus stop, so I started getting my stuff together when I saw a black van with tinted windows, so I couldn't see inside, and so I wasn't too scared, because a boy. We'll call him Bryson. So me and Bryson were walking and talking about how much work our 4th block teacher gave us, until I turned around because I thought I heard a car, and the black van was slowly following us, so I told Bryson to get out the street so the car could pass. We got out the street, but the car was still following us, and I asked Bryson if he could walk me home, but his mom had to leave for work when he got home and he had to watch his little brother, so he walked up his driveway and went in. So that left me all alone, with the black van still following me, so I texted my mom asking if she was home, and just my luck she wasn't. Even worse, my sister was at practice, and my mom didn't get off until 7. My heart was beating out my chest, then the van pulled up next to me, now keeping pace, and asked if I needed a ride home, and I was being the nice person I was and said no thanks, I'm fine, and he said come on, get in, and I can now see 2 other heads in the back moving, and still being nice, I say, my dad's waiting for me to come home before 5 o'clock. Mind you, I was in middle school, and my school didn't dismiss until 4:35, and so he said, stop lying to me. You're home alone until 7 o'clock tonight. Now get in the car. My heart immediately dropped. I was in track and field, so I can easily run home without getting tired, but I was just in shock, and then he yelled at me, saying, if you don't get in the car right now, I'll end your niece, and if anyone truly knows me, they know that my niece means the absolute world to me, and also my niece is only 7 months old, and again, I was a 12-year-old girl. And so I said in the most tough voice I can make and said, if you go anywhere near my niece, you'll regret everything, and I mean everything that you just said. My mom keeps a Glock 36 in her closet, and I'm most definitely not scared to get it, therefore, stay away from me and don't go anywhere near my niece. He actually looked pretty scared, but that didn't scare him off. My mom truly did own a Glock 36, and he continued following me. This is kind of off topic, but I grew up in Indiana, where it's kill or get killed, so I had to learn how to work a gun at a young age. So he kept following me, telling me to get into the car. The men in the back were now visible, telling me to get into the car. At this point I was ignoring them walking home. I knew if they wouldn't leave me alone, I would go get my mom's gun, and if they still didn't leave, I would fire at one of their feet. So when I got into my driveway, they were telling me to get my mom's gun, so I went in and got my mom's gun, and they pulled off faster than I've ever seen a car go, and I managed to get their license down. Let's never meet again, and I better never in my life see you around my niece. Never hunt alone. This happened back in the fall of 2016. I live in a tiny and rural community where everyone knows everyone. The state that I live in allows rifle, mule deer, buck hunting during the first week of October. Sustenance hunting is essential in the culture of my area. This fall I was lucky enough to have drawn a buck tag. I had made plans to hunt on my grandmother's farm this evening. Given that I am a smaller woman, I had asked my husband to go with me in case I killed something. He could help me pack it out. However, he could not go due to work obligations. Fine, no problem. I have hunted this farm many times by myself. I know it like the back of my hand. I strapped on my boots, grabbed my rifle and binoculars, tucked my cell phone into my pocket, and made my way to my Jeep. My grandmother's farm consists of corn, bordering an alfalfa field along a river. Between the river and the farm are lines of old-growth trees. This is the perfect place to fill at a buck tag. I parked my Jeep about a mile upriver from the fields, then began walking along the tree line toward the area where the deer had mostly been feeding. At the opposite end of the field, there is a large haystack where all the harvested alfalfa is stored. As I saw it coming into my field of view, I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I kneeled down and viewed the area through my binoculars. I could see a very tall, large man walking briskly towards me from behind the haystack. I knew for a fact that I was supposed to be the only one hunting this farm on this night, as I had just spoken to my grandmother. Something inside me told me I needed to get out of the area as fast as I could. I initially tried to turn around and walk back down the trees to my Jeep. But given that I have such short legs, this guy was quickly closing the gap quickly. He was still several hundred yards from me, so I decided to try to cross the river instead. I found that the river was too muddy and deep for me to safely cross. I thought my only option was to attempt to get signal on my cell phone. When he walked across a small ditch and disparaged from my line of sight, I quickly darted into the corn and kept quiet. I could hear him walking closer and closer. I desperately tried to call my husband. Back then, the closest cell towers were over 30 miles away, and cell service was extremely spotty. I could not connect to my husband or 911. By this point, the man was within 100 yards of me. I could hear him ripping corn out, stomping around, and loudly cussing, "Where the duck did you go?" Another issue is that it was getting dark quickly. I definitely did not want to be in the dark alone with this man. I watched him for a few minutes and was able to determine that he did not have a gun. After weighing my options, I decided to step out and see if I could de-escalate the situation, as I work in healthcare and work with mentally unstable people all the time. I stepped out of the corn. "Hi, I'm sorry if I interrupted your hunt or something. I did not mean to cause any harm," I said with a sweet smile on my face. I made sure there was at least 80 yards of distance between us. His eyes locked with mine, and it was obvious there was something with this man. He stood about 6 feet 5 inches tall. His clothes were absolutely filthy, stained with what appeared to be his own waste and sweat. His shirt was torn and had dried blood on it. His face was crooked as if he had had a stroke prior, and he slurred his words. "There you ducking are," he yelled. He reached down and grabbed a massive stick. I'm talking a stick at least 5 feet long. He could have easily killed me with this stick. I stood my ground and grabbed my rifle from my back and pointed it at him. He stopped holding the stick. We looked at each other for a second when he began yelling. "Do you know whose farm you're on?" I stated, "Yes, this is my grandmother's farm. I've hunted it my whole life." The veins began to pop out of his head. "No. This is not. My wife is hunting in this cornfield, and you ruined it. Because of you, she missed a huge buck, you stupid bitch." He became so enraged he started making strange growling sounds and started spitting everywhere. I was running through the options in my head at this point when he suddenly started to lunge at me. I turned the safety off my rifle and loudly stated, "Stop, I will shoot if I have to." He froze in his tracks and just stared at me for about 30 seconds before dropping the stick. He grunted loudly with his eyes darting around. "Listen, I don't want to have to do something we will both regret. I am very sorry I ruined your hunt. If you turn around and walk away from me, I will leave," I calmly explained. I could see his thinking hard about what to do next when he mumbled, "Fine. and turned around, stomping back towards the haystack. My heart was about to beat out of my chest. I was not about to turn my back on this man, though. I watched until he walked a distance away, and then I darted back into the corn. I thought back on how he said I spooked a massive buck and ruined his wife's hunt, but that did not make any sense. I had a good view of the whole field, and there were no deer present. I decided to observe him through my binoculars. I watched him climb up to the haystack and get into a small, two-door white car. He quickly peeled out of the haystack lot. I was able to catch that the car had California license plates, but nothing more. I live nowhere near California. He took off down the road. And he was alone. No one else was in that vehicle. I ran back to my Jeep and locked myself in it. I sped home as fast as I could and told my husband what happened. I had never seen this man in my life, and neither had my husband based off my description. We live in a community of about 200 people. Born and raised here, we know everyone. I called our local sheriff, and they came out and took a statement. I took them to the haystack where he was parked, and we found a knife lying on the ground. Of course, nothing could be done as I was not able to get a plate number or a name from the man. To this day, I still have no idea what the man's intentions were, even though I could guess on a few. It's been 8 years, and I have never seen this man again. I also decided that I'd be hunting with a buddy from then on. Walking alone at night. I live in a very safe area, but on this night I didn't feel at all safe. For context, I am a 23-year-old girl. I live in a suburb of a large Midwestern city. This suburb is the safest area on this side of the state, with almost zero crime. I once went and shadowed the city judge for a class, and on a busy night, the biggest issue was a noise complaint. The city is known for having harsh punishments even for something as simple as a parking ticket, so no one messes around. On a 10-minute walk, you are bound to see at least 2 police cars patrolling at any time of day. With this being said, I have always felt very safe in the city and often enjoy going for walks at night in the summer. I live a few blocks from a large park with a nice trail and tennis courts, and in the summer my dog and I will go out for late night walks. She is an all-black border collie, so she tends to overheat if we go during the day, and if we go at night, I can throw around a forgotten tennis ball for her. This has become such a ritual that I don't even tell my fiancée when I go out. I am sure you can see where this may become an issue. If the night is nice, we will walk for hours around the sleepy city. I have never had an issue in the 3 years I have lived here, and the only people I see are nice police officers that wave as they pass by. One evening my dog and I went out like usual. The summer night was warm, and I was wearing pajama shorts and a tank top. I only grabbed my keys, no phone. We began our normal walk up to the park. We moved through the quiet streets and enjoy the night air. As we reached the park, we stopped for a beat-up truck with a camper shell that turns onto the street that runs along the park. The driver turns very slowly and eyes us. I assume he is slowing turning because my dog was off leash and he thinks she will run into the road. We wait passionately for him to pass and then cross the street. The tennis court lights are still on, so we walk along the street and enter the courts through the front gate. This is the only gate to the courts that most people know about since there is a sign and benches next to it. I pick up a forgotten ball and begin throwing it for my dog. After a few throws, she stops suddenly and looks at the street. I follow her gaze and see the same beat-up truck driving by the court slowly. I think the man must disapprove of me having my dog off leash, and I glare at the truck as it passes. There is no one else around to be upset by my dog, so I feel justified in my actions. When I do this, the truck suddenly speeds off. I huff proudly to myself and call my dog to me so we can continue playing. But is still staring at the direction of the truck and gives a little woof. Border collies are known for their intelligence, and they often bond with one person very strongly. There have been many times where she has read my emotions and reacted to them, signaling to me if I was starting to have a panic attack or getting between my fiancé and me if we were arguing. She's smart. But I was fine. Why was she still staring at the truck if I wasn't upset? I marked it as odd but encouraged her to continue playing. After a little while longer, the truck drove by again, just as before. Slowly while it passed us and then sped up. This time the hair went up on my neck. I reached for my phone but realized I had left it at home. I decided that staying in the well-lit tennis courts would be better than going back out onto the dark streets, and I thought for sure the driver wouldn't return. I am a very tall woman, about 5 feet 9 inches, and I work out often, so men tend not to scare me. I try to tell myself all of this, but the hair on my neck still won't go down. Suddenly my dog stops again and begins to growl. The truck is racing down the hill next to the park and stops suddenly beside the entrance to the tennis courts. I get myself into a fighting stance, but no one gets out of the truck, nothing happens. The truck is parked under a light, so shadows are cast on the cab. Suddenly the driver gets out, but does to the back of the truck and gets something out of the camper shell. It is clear that he is staying out of sight because he stays on the far side of the truck and awkwardly reaches into the shell, so all I can see is his arm. I can't see what he pulls out, but I know I need to get out of there. In his eyes, he sees a young girl in tight clothes with no phone or bag who he is just trapped in a 20-foot tall cage while he guards the only door. A true fight or flight instinct kicks in, and I think about yelling threats to the man so he will come out and I can face him, but I don't know if he has a weapon. So I decide to flee. There is a back gate to the tennis courts that no one really knows about because it has been grown over by a huge pine tree. The only reason I know it is there is because my dog slipped through it once after a poorly thrown ball. I now have a plan. I take my eyes off of the truck and pick up the tennis ball. I call my dog back to me, and I pretend like everything is fine. I hype her up the best I can and then throw the ball hard. She takes off after it, and I sprint in the opposite direction for the hidden gate. I dive through the gate into the darkness. The park behind me is dark, with only a few lights, but instead of running deep into it, I backtrack and slip under the overgrown pine tree. I see my dog turn with the ball and begin looking for me. I give a soft whistle, and her eyes find me in the darkness. She drops the ball and begins running towards me. She slips through the gate, and her black coat is lost in the darkness as she joins me under the tree. I hold her close as we watch the truck. I hear the driver's door open again, and I can see a man get out. He looks around, angry and bewildered by my sudden disappearance. He scans the park, looking for movement. I pray he won't come looking for us. Finally, he gets back in his truck and burns out down the road. I wait until the sound of his engine is completely gone and I bolt across the street towards my house. We stayed in the shadows as we made our way back home, only coming out when we could see the house, and both began to run. We made it home with no sign of the truck or its driver. I try not to think of what harm that man meant for me or how foolish I was to put myself in that situation. I still go out for late night walks, but I make sure to take a phone and tell my fiancée where I'm going and for how long. I won't be afraid in my own neighborhood, but I won't be stupid either. Aw man, I'm going to get shit for this one, but here goes. A shadow thing we just referred to as the 8-foot tall guy. Gonna keep this short. It was around New Year's in 2000, and I was 18. Had 6 friends over to hang out since parents were going to be out really late. I lived in the middle of the woods out in the country, in the Midwest. There is a big machine shed about 200 yards away from the house lit up by a stadium light. There is another in front of the house, so the surrounding yards were dimly lit. We had left a bunch of liquor up at the bar in the shed, and 3 of us started walking up there while the others were in the house. When we were about 50 feet away, we saw this person-like figure bolt out of the shed. The main door is always open, and run into the trees. And I mean fast. It was maybe 10 feet from that site, yet somehow none of us could see anything but its shape. We naturally thought some dipshits were robbing my shed, and we were a bit spooked, but being young redneck boys with an overdeveloped sense of cowboyism, I told one friend to run back to get the others and my gun. Me and the other friend waited under the light. My friend and I saw the figure right away. That whole timber to the west has very low weed cover, and the trees are spread evenly apart, which made it easy to watch it. As we strained to keep an eye on it through the dimly lit trees, it started moving around slowly. We watched as it stepped behind a tree and just vanished. The tree wasn't thick, maybe 9 inches in diameter, but the figure stepped behind it on one side and simply didn't appear on the opposite side. Now my friend and I'd adrenaline spiked as we whispered hurriedly things like WTF and did you see that? As we were quizzing each other and panning around to find it, the rest of the group came running up. One friend had the smarts to hop in his car and drive up so his headlights could light up the whole scene. My friend handed me my .22 rifle and apparently decided to bring all the rest of my guns, 2 pistols and a shotgun, so now a fairly armed group. We were hicks, but we were nerdy hicks, so I'm sure we looked quite the sight. We all see the thing as it casually yet purposefully steps out from behind a different tree than before. Now everyone is on edge as every signal in my brain screams, alarm, something's not right, alarm. We all sensed it and saw what we each saw, but no one spoke at that time. We were too fixated and shocked at what we were seeing. Later in the night, as we all sat around sharing our perception of what happened, we all said the same things we couldn't comprehend at the time. When it stepped out, it didn't cast a shadow. The headlights and fixed lamp were casting plenty of light into the trees now, and the trees' shadows and our shadows were there, but not this thing. Its head was narrower and longer than normal. Its arms too, and it was tall, hence the 8-foot tall guy moniker. It moved briskly to another tree and disappeared like before. A few moments later, it walked out from behind a different tree 10 feet away in the opposite direction. It was like it teleported. It then repeated this game several more times. All this allowed us to get plenty of eyes on it, but not me or anyone else could describe it. It's like the lights lit up everything around it, but not the thing itself. Except the eyes, we all agreed it had silver eyes, but the crazy part? We all only saw the eyes out of our peripherals, they just weren't there if you looked at it dead on. After several minutes of this, I finally raised my rifle and tried to sound tough. This is private property, and we are armed. Come towards us slowly and show yourself, or I will shoot. That thing stopped dead in its tracks, turned to face me, and studied us for a moment, and then, with purpose, it extended a leg and stepped behind a tree that couldn't have been 4 inches wide and vanished. Several minutes go by and nothing. We eventually decide to huddle up and go back to the house. The buddy in the car drives down ahead. We made it maybe 20 feet when a friend's girlfriend starts screaming. The thing was following us about 50 feet south of us, hugging the tree line. It moved wrong, like it was moving its body from a pouncing, slightly crouched over posture to a sprint posture, all while jogging slowly. It literally made your brain hit the brakes hard as it tried to make sense of the visual input. There's a great book by Stephen King called From a Buick 8 where these cops come across this humanoid creature from another dimension that's so incredibly different from ourselves that their brains can't handle it, and they are overcome with fear so terribly that they beat the creature to death in a fit of insanity and fear and rage. Every time I think back to that deep, instinctual fear that we felt that night, and every time I say the way it moved, looked, or behaved was just wrong, I think of that scene in that book. Collectively, everyone that had a gun opened fire without a word. It was if we all had the same instinctual response. Now I can't speak for my friends, but I am and have always been a crack shot with a rifle. I was just raised hunting since I could walk, so I was shocked when I watched leaves blown apart and branches snap and dirt kick up as the collective firing of birdshot, 22, 38, and 44 ammo blew everything apart around that thing, but that thing itself never seemed to be hit. I'm going to sum up the rest as it went by in a blur. We all ran for the house when the ammo dried up. Some were already inside, including the dogs who were terrified of the thing. Or maybe they were scared of us, who knows? We huddled in the living room and waited. Soon we heard footsteps clattering across the porch, and I mean clatter as in the thing had nails of some sort, but let me tell you those sounds were strange and unique too. Next we heard it seemingly climbing up the side of the house behind us, click 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 across the roof, and then a thud as it jumped 3 stories down to the ground. Then rinse and repeat on every side of the house, sometimes repeatedly and sometimes with minutes of pauses between. Eventually we escorted each other to the bathroom, and I and a friend saw it through the sliding glass deck doors as it launched itself over the deck railing, a 15-foot drop there, as we walked back from the bathroom. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the thing seemed to stop. Not long after, my parents' car turned into our driveway. We all agreed to hightail it to my room because there's no way we're trying to explain all of the guns out and what happened all night. As soon as we got to my room, someone did mention, shouldn't we warn them? We all had the feeling they would be okay, so we didn't, but looking back and telling this as an adult now, good God, yes, we should have warned them. I had a large 2-room basement bedroom. It sounds fancier than it was, trust me, so we just got comfortable and turned my TV on. My parents came inside, and eventually my mom poked her head in to say goodnight, none the wiser to all that we'd been through. We all tried to sleep soon after that, and we all slept like hell, but it didn't bother us anymore that night. Throughout the rest of that year, there were several more credible sightings from everyone in the group. Even a couple more people got pulled into the story as they were with us when we'd see it again. I think about 11 people overall got to clearly see it that year. Nothing to write about because, well, how do I explain this? Have you ever noticed that when people want to ignore something, even something dangerous, they pretend it isn't happening? Like, okay, yes, we see this thing, but there's nothing we can do about it or get closure on anything about it, so what can you do? You just go about your life, and if you happen to see it running toward you and your friend as you walk to the car at night, you both just hurry up, get in, lock the doors, and speed off. And go in with your night. Rinse and repeat throughout the year. P.S. Yes, over the years I've tried to find info. The closest thing I've found is Native American and First Nations lore about shadow spirits and shadow people, but they didn't seem to fit just right. And yes, I'm a very skeptical person. I am very married to science and common sense. But that thing, well, my brain just goes, I got nothing, you're on your own, buddy. Maybe it was interdimensional, or an alien, or a demon, or some spirit. Except none of those answers feel right and most sound crazy as shit to me, so I dunno. Even 20 years later, I still struggle with impulsively trying to downplay any of it because I can't explain it rationally. P.S. Yes, I still go into wooded areas at night and other places. I never fear anything happening. I love camping. However, I inherited that same homestead a few years ago, and I notice I am uneasy as hell being outside at night here. I run a small farm there though, so I have to be out after dark. I haven't seen anything yet, and I hope I don't. Normally you know when it's around, your anxiety goes from 0 to a red line the moment you step into the dark, and that's how you know it's coming. That hasn't happened yet, but the past few weeks something has been feeling a bit off. I don't carry a gun with me usually. I've convinced myself over the years that it's ultimately benign, so if I see it, I'm going to do my best to either ignore it or converse with it. God help me. About 6 years ago, when I was roughly 20 years old, my mom and I took a trip to another property we owned, which was located in a resort near the beach. I've lived in the city my whole life but always loved being near the ocean, and so whenever we visited this property, I would take every opportunity to go for walks on the beach, even if that meant going by myself. Despite living in a fairly dangerous country in terms of violent crime rates, the resort was located in a more remote part of the country and was therefore considered quite safe. The resort itself had access to a private beach, and the only other way to access this part of the beach other than through the resort itself was from the fishing spot roughly 500 meters to the right of the resort's beach entrance or from a path that led to a cul-de-sac 300 meters to the left. There were no other properties near the cul-de-sac, and this path was mainly used by other people who were staying in properties further up the hill who did not have direct access to the beach like we did. One particular day I decided to go for a walk by myself since my mom was taking a nap and I was bored. We had owned this property for many years and had been going there since I was a child, taking walks on the beach by myself ever since I was about 14 or 15 years old without event. I set off, taking my phone and earphones with me so that I could listen to some relaxing music on my walk. I walked across the long boardwalk that led through the line of trees separating the resort from the beach, and once I got down the wooden steps and onto the beach, I decided to go left and head for the lagoon about a kilometer away. When I passed the path that led to the cul-de-sac, I walked past a group of about 6 or 7 young boys. And when I say young, I mean they varied in age, with the youngest being around 10 and the oldest around 15. One thing it's important to note about these boys, however, is that they were not from the area and looked to be from the small rural village not too far from the resort. I didn't think much of this at first, as the village they most likely came from was in the hills and not near a beach, and so I figured they probably just wanted to go for a swim, and this was the only place they could do it. They all looked at me as I walked by, but I ignored them and kept walking. After about half an hour, I reached the lagoon and spent roughly another hour here before deciding to return to the resort. The sun was beginning to set, and the normally quiet beach was now practically deserted. In the distance, however, I could see that the group of boys was still on the beach. I wasn't happy about having to walk past them again after how they had stared at me earlier, but decided that if I kept my distance, picked up the pace a little, and ignored them again, I would be fine. When I reached them, they were halfway up the beach on the soft sand, and I walked as close to the water as possible without actually walking in it. As I passed them, I saw them start excitedly talking to one another, and I discreetly paused my music to try and hear what they were saying, even though they were speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They started following me once I passed them, and panic immediately set in. You may be wondering why, since they were just a group of kids, but what you need to understand is that in the rural villages in my country, the children often don't receive any formal education, and therefore it is not uncommon for them to resort to crime in order to help support their families. They can be ruthless and violent and won't hesitate to physically harm you if they deem it necessary in order to get what they want, whether it be valuables or something more sinister. I was also a young female, by myself, and only weighed about 60 kilograms, 130 pounds. I wasn't particularly strong and would have been no match for a group of 6 to 7 young boys. I removed my earphones and hid my phone under my clothes, all the while trying to walk faster without making it obvious. If they decided to run at me, there was no way I would be able to outrun them, especially not on the soft sand I would have to cross to get back into the resort. I slowly got closer to the resort, my heart pounding, watching them out of the corner of my eye as they got closer and closer behind me. I was now 100 meters away from the steps leading back to the resort. 50 meters. 20 meters. Eventually I reached the steps, the group of boys still following behind me, and to my relief I saw that the groundskeeper for the resort was sweeping at the top of the steps. He looked up and saw me, and then noticed the group of boys behind me. The minute they saw him, they took off down the beach, back in the direction they had come from. If I needed any proof that these boys had malicious intentions, this was it. I finally broke into a run, taking the steps 2 at a time and crossing the boardwalk in less than half the time it normally took, trying to put as much distance between myself and those boys as possible. I finally reached the end of the boardwalk, and, Doubled over trying to catch my breath, I began to cry. The relief was indescribable, and to this day I am so thankful for that groundskeeper being in the right place at the right time. I don't even want to think about what those boys would have done to me had they been given the chance. Needless to say, I never went for a walk on that beach by myself again. I live in an area of the northwestern United States that is heavily forested and mountainous, with a large river valley that was carved out of the earth by the movement of glaciers a millennia ago, and thus there are many leftover deposits of glacial sediment forming high plateaus, separated by deep ravines, most of which hold small, heavily forested swamps in between them. Most of these ravines and canyons are too steep, and the soil is much too loose to make traveling over them feasible even for the local wildlife, and so many of them act as their own little ecosystems, each one cut off from the next by walls of glacial silt. I think it's noteworthy enough to mention that this whole valley is sacred to the surrounding indigenous people, known as the Eye of the Dove, and was used as a massive burial ground. Roughly 1 year ago, I decided to go and take myself out for a day of harvesting some of the spring wild edibles that grow in these swampy oases, wild onions, wild garlic, and the like. I decided to go to an area I'd yet to explore. Although I was quite familiar with the surrounding area, the specific ravine was new to me. I packed my bag, inspected my rifle, and set out walking, eager to see what Mother Nature would provide me with that day. Upon arriving at the entrance to the ravine, I paused to take in my surroundings, listened to the migratory birds singing their songs, and noted that the wildlife was busy as ever going about their day-to-day lives amongst the timber. I set out through the undergrowth, eyes to the ground, searching for anything of interest. After walking approximately 1/4 mile into the ravine, I took a short break to sip some water and pick some pine buds for tea. I became aware of the most overpowering silence I've ever heard. Any adept woodsman will tell you that silence is the loudest sound in the timber, and for good reason, as most creatures try to avoid being lunch for something higher on the food chain. I readied my rifle, scanned the short distance I could see through the undergrowth, and noticed just ahead of time, the skull of a small goat perched about eye level in the branches of a small fir tree. This immediately struck me as rather odd, since there were no farms, houses, or homesteads for several miles in any direction. Curious but somewhat unnerved at this point, I decided to press on and chalk it up to someone trying to keep people away from a good foraging area, although that didn't explain the silence. I took maybe 20 to 30 steps further and noticed the skeleton of a deer, piled up under a cedar tree. I made my way over to it, inspected it as I collect bones as well, noticed that it was still quite ripe, and decided to move on. As I was looking up from the first bone pile, I noticed another one, this time a cow elk, not 15 feet away. I repeated the same process again, and as I looked up from this second pile, I noticed a third, a coyote, strewn across a 10-meter area, only identifiable by the skull. Rather nervous at this point, with the hair on my neck standing up and the electric feeling of adrenaline in my gut, I scanned ahead, and to my dismay, I could see multiple skeletons of various animals, all in various states of decay, perhaps 6 in my immediate field of view. Most were deer, with the occasional elk, coyote, and what I figured to be either a young mountain lion or lynx. By this point I had my rifle shouldered and all my body systems on high alert. I moved forward as stealthily as I could and began to count the corpses in my immediate field of view as I passed them and noted the smell of decay, mixed with the pungent scent of swamp detritus that was heavy in the air. It seemed like there were new piles of bones, skin, or fur every 20 feet for the approximately 300 meters further I moved through the swamp. Still dead silent, and due to the dense old growth of cedar, very dark at this point. Coming close to the end of the marshy area of the ravine, I entered a small opening in the timber, with just enough of an opening in the canopy to provide a much-needed bastion of light. No less than a second after I stopped, I heard what I can only describe as a Louisville Slugger swing harder than any man could swing and make impact with a tree somewhere out of sight ahead of me. This happened 3 times in quick succession, each time with an ear-splitting crack. It caught me off guard. I've spent most of my life roaming the woods, and I've never heard anything like it. I felt the adrenaline rush over my body, the extreme sense of heightened awareness that comes with fight or flight. Every hackle on my body was up, and the only noise discernible in the immense silence that followed was my own heartbeat. I said out loud the only thing that came to mind, message received, and promptly about-faced and made my way out as quickly as I could without losing any situational awareness I had left in the near panic that I felt. I've since been back to this place, with a party this time as I refused to go alone. After leaving, it was agreed that the whole area had a feeling like it didn't want us to leave. Maybe it was just nerves, perhaps the placebo effect, but recollecting this whole event has given me goosebumps, and I don't think I'll sleep well tonight. I'd be very interested to hear what you all have to say about it.